Well, it looks like the number of participants is stabilizing. So welcome everybody to our webinar today. I'm John Holamka, president of Mayo Clinic Platform. And today we're going to have an incredible discussion about achieving broad participation in meaningful clinical research at the point of care. And this is being brought to you today by this coalition we've put together, we call Advancing Coalition, at Advancing Clinical Trials at the Point of Care. This coalition is an organization brought together of multiple stakeholders. We've tried to bring together government, academia, and industry. There are health systems, there are community health organizations, health research organizations, and other collaborators that support the design and the conduct of clinical trials, and clinical trial networks. You'll see the current membership on the screen, and the membership is continuously evolving. And of course, we welcome new participants and new members. One important thing to stress is this group has been largely fueled by health systems, leadership of health systems, frontline providers. All are demanding better evidence generation as we think of real-world evidence and real-world data and accelerating clinical trial participation. The commitment from these health systems is the impetus for the work that you're going to hear about. We go to the next slide. The coalition is focused on increasing participation in clinical trials at the point of care. It means improving patient access to treatments and facilitating development of targeted therapies and important impacts on patient outcomes. Point of care clinical trials typically integrate care delivery and clinical research, and maybe a more sustainable method, more sustainable model and approach of clinical research that has a capacity to cut costs, reduce infrastructure needs, increase patient and provider involvement in clinical trials. Because we recognize sometimes our trials today don't have the power that we want. We don't have the heterogeneity of patients that we want enrolled. The coalition hopes to engage clinicians in a broader range of care settings, developing and adopting effective data collection tools, new digital modalities, collaboration with experts in trial conduct, enrolling diverse heterogeneous participants, and unmet medical needs we hope will be addressed. We hope we will improve technology working together, supporting the capabilities for clinical trial sites in various communities. These goals are all in support of augmenting the ability of clinical trials to generate meaningful evidence and become more sustainable over time. It's a priority for healthcare organizations like the Mayo Clinic that want to generate better evidence and improve patient outcomes. During the meeting today, we're going to explore barriers to broader clinical trial participation by clinicians at the point of care and discuss what solutions might help us overcome some of the friction, some of the barriers. And as you'll hear in later sessions, the coalition is primarily focused on two major areas: developing digital tools, commonly reusable components that make it easier for frontline providers at a broader range of sites to participate. But we also need to explore regulatory reform, reimbursement, and health system policies that enable point-of-care trial designs. I often talk about this combination of technology plus policy plus culture is really what helps us with transformation. We hope to consider how enabling more clinical research at the point of care will help us close major gaps in evidence generation, improve patient access to care and treatment, and move us to a learning healthcare system. Before we begin, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Trevin Locke from the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy to go over a few considerations for discussion, as well as the topics you can expect for today's event. So Trevin.
Thanks, John. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Just a quick couple of meeting reminders to help situate you to this Zoom webinar. First, we encourage you throughout the event and our discussions to submit questions through the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. For all of the panel discussions, we hope to incorporate your questions. So please do feel free to submit throughout the conversation. And as you'll see, this meeting is also being recorded. We will be posting the recording and the slide deck online in the few days or in a week or so following this meeting. So these slides and the recording will be readily available for your viewing. Next slide, please. I'll quickly go through the agenda. We're going to open with a discussion featuring Dr. Janet Woodcock, the FDA Principal Deputy Commissioner, and Dr. Mark McCullen, Director of Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. As many of you know, Dr. Woodcock works closely with the Commissioner of Food and Drugs to develop and implement key public health initiatives and oversees the agency's day-to-day functions. Over the course of the pandemic, she served in a variety of critical roles, including overseeing therapeutic development as part of Operation Warp Speed and later as acting commissioner of the FDA. From the keynote, we will have four discussion sessions with moderated discussion and Q&A. The first of which will feature representatives from health systems participating in the Active POC Coalition, who will discuss their interests and experiences in improving evidence generation and care quality. From there, we'll go to session 2, which will explore 2 promising areas for progress that the coalition is exploring, cardiovascular disease and pandemic preparedness. And we'll highlight priorities for implementation of point-of-care research in these areas as we move into the future. And then the final 2 sessions will focus on those major areas that Dr. Halamka mentioned, how we might use digital tools in clinical trials and accelerate digital tool validation and adoption to increase efficiency in evidence generation. And then finally, a focus on policy considerations for broadening participation in clinical trials, including regulatory and reimbursement strategies to better incentivize both patient and clinician participation. And then we will adjourn today's meeting at 5:15 Eastern Time. Now I'm happy to turn it over to Drs. Woodcock and McCullen for our opening discussion. I should note that due to their busy schedules, this was pre-recorded a few days ago. Thanks again for joining us today.
Janet, thanks so much for joining us today. And since we're perhaps entering a new phase of the COVID pandemic, I was thinking we might start there from the standpoint of the importance of clinical trials and evidence in helping to address important public and population health threats. During the pandemic, you had a couple of notable jobs. One was leading the therapeutic response on Operation Warp Speed in 2020. A second was serving as acting commissioner for the first year of the Biden administration and the rollout of the vaccines and all of the steps that went along with the COVID response over the past, over the 2021 time period, and still playing an important role as Principal Deputy Commissioner now. During that time, you did a lot of work focusing on clinical trial evidence, which I think led you to conclude that the clinical trial capabilities weren't where we needed them to be for rapidly determining which therapeutics really worked and how to respond effectively to the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit more about that experience and what some of the implications are for clinical trial preparedness for future pandemics or even future COVID variants and waves?
Sure. I mean, it was quite a learning experience for me. We had new molecular entities like new vaccines and new therapeutics that needed to be tested, such as the monoclonal antibodies. And we had a lot of repurposed drugs that people were using sort of willy-nilly to see that were on the market to see if they would help with COVID. And I think in a lot of the pandemic planning that has gone on over the years, as usual, people forgot about the clinical evaluation phase, that you don't just discover these things and develop them, you have to see whether they work. And so I don't think we were really prepared to get that done. The paper we published about the number of trials, both worldwide and in the US, of therapeutics, thousands of trials, most of them not randomized or very small randomized. Most of them didn't accrue enough patients to learn anything. Only about 5% of those trials that we looked at of therapeutics had any hope of shedding any light and, yielding actionable information. So people were going around trying things in a trial setting, but all those patients didn't go into efforts to really find out solid evidence that could guide treatment. And then when we did set up trials, for example, the active trials and the company trials that were supported and so forth, what we saw was there was competition for the patients. And we had large integrated health systems, and they had lots of people in their suburban hospitals and their peripheral hospitals sick and dying and in the ICU and all that. And we couldn't study them. Why? They had no study personnel. They had no PIs. They had never participated in trials. And so the concentration of the research ecosystem in the United States in the major medical centers or CRO sites, which are very selective, meant that most of the people who were sick with COVID, either as outpatients or inpatients, we couldn't reach very well to evaluate new treatments. Now, we did set up the Active 6 trial, which is a pragmatic trial, and it was very hands-off intervention with the people, the patients, and that was able to enroll very rapidly because used modern technology, and they were using drugs that we had a lot of experience with to assay them, and we didn't have a lot of safety problems. So it showed that can be done. But in contrast, over in the UK, we had recovery, and that generated a huge amount of evidence, a pragmatic trial. Some people complained about some of the design issues, but the trial was designed to work for practitioners who are caring for sick COVID patients, right? And so some of the, you can't do like double blind and all this stuff, that adds so much effort. So basically, bottom line, I know this has been a long story, but we weren't really prepared, I think, to launch and execute and finish trials that would really give us evidence. We probably delayed the availability of treatments, or in fact, knowledge about what not to use. And we have to do better by trying to be able to set up pragmatic trials and not have these small trials going on that really are not going to be useful.
And we're going to come back later in this event, in this conference, to some of the steps that could be taken in the future to prevent that from happening again. Are there any particular ones that you'd like to call out in terms of lessons learned that should be incorporated in clinical trial platform planning for the next wave or the next pandemic threat?
Yes, well, I believe that, we need to, just like we have stockpiles in reserve and everything, we need to have some capacity available, right, to evaluate interventions, no matter what kind of disaster we have, if we need new interventions. And so I think planning in advance, maybe having an emergency agreements that we put in place in advance, so folks agree to work together, rather than all these separate little trials. We agree from the get-go that should an emergency occur, here's how we'll work together. I think that would work out much better. And of course, everyone knows, I also believe we need to move clinical research out into the community so that we have a much greater penetration of clinical research into the whole trial ecosystem. And that's a larger issue that doesn't just pertain to pandemics.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that larger issue, because that is really what is bringing us together for the Advancing Clinical Trials at the Point of Care Coalition. This, as you know, is a diverse range of healthcare system who, from the leadership levels on down to the frontline clinicians, want to see those problems solved, more relevant evidence, not just for COVID response or whatever the next public health threat is, but filling in the key evidence gaps in so many other areas of clinical practice. Could you talk a bit more about not only from the COVID experience, but your experience more generally about evidence gaps on why it's so important to have that clinical trial capacity in the community at the point of care, and what kinds of things we can do to help get there.
Sure, that's a tall order, Mark. I might talk.
Yeah, well, that's why we're starting with you.
Okay, so to first talk about the evidence gaps. Okay, when a drug is approved in the United States, as you well know, and most people probably know, we know something about it. We know it works in a certain situation, but we don't know its place in the armamentarium. And we don't know its effect in a lot of different comorbidities and so forth. And we don't know this and we don't know that. We don't know how to stage it, how long people should stay on it, what they should start on first, what they should get on next, and so forth. So there's so many relevant clinical questions that go unanswered by simply focusing on the pre-market drug development. But we don't have a good system for generating that evidence post-market. But we could do it in the course of clinical practice if we were only organized better, if we only got our act together, right? So the issue of the point of care, which I love that term, clinical research, I think that's so important. For evidence generation, you know, it will provide a greater patient pool. It will provide the generalizability, because we know that many of the determinants of health are the social of the clinical trial ecosystem is restricted to very specific parts of the country, right? Around the major medical centers, around the CRO sites. So there are many, many places that are sort of clinical research deserts that don't have any kind of access for patients for clinical trials. So we don't have the reach to most of the patients, and we also don't have all the variety of people and socioeconomic circumstances and other kind of circumstances that we need to have that generalizability. In addition, you know, I think there's a social justice aspect here. Sometimes access to clinical trials is your best shot at saving your life, for example, in some cancer trials with the pace of cancer drug development. But the same areas as those research deserts, they don't have access. And how many people are suffering from a diagnosis of cancer, you know, want to get up and go 150 miles for every appointment. They want to be cared for. Most people want to be cared for by the people who care for them in the communities they're familiar with. So I think that's a very important aspect too. And so there are many compelling reasons that research should be moved out. And I think the final one is that, what do you call it, Mark, the fourth translational step? I mean, getting practitioners to actually use the new products.
Yeah.
Okay. So right now we have clinical researchers who are in like very specialized areas or specialists, and they do the trials and they generate the evidence and publish it in the New England Journal of Medicine, right? But in fact, what is the uptake like around the country? It's often very, very slow. And it may be concentrated in those areas where people actually have familiarity with clinical research, had some hand in the trials, or knew people who were PIs on the trials and so forth. And, you know, we have relied on detailing and other methods to get the word out to the rest of the community. But I think it's much more desirable to have that community also engaged in the clinical research enterprise. So for all those reasons, I think this really needs to be done, but we do need to talk about, well, how do we get it done?
Well, I do want to turn to how we get it done. One of the other win-win areas that we've heard about in the early days of this ACT at Point of Care Coalition is opportunities for some of these big areas of unmet medical need: cardiovascular disease, cardiometabolic, cancer, as you were talking about. A lot of times the evidence, as you said, just doesn't seem relevant to particular segments within these very big populations based on demographic, race, ethnicity factors, based on where they live, the way their preferences, the way they prefer to get care. There are really a whole bunch of different segments within these broad populations. As this moves forward, do you see a way for FDA regulatory claims maybe being related to particular segments of the population that could come out of these population-focused efforts where, what we hear from a lot of the healthcare systems is they really want to treat each segment, each type of person, each person as effectively as possible, but they don't feel like the evidence that they're getting is really relevant to all of those segments. And on the manufacturer side, lots of complaints about utilization review and other steps that might get in the way of just targeting that right combination of treatments, the right patient.
Right. Well, this, I think, gets into, to a great extent, that post-market evidence generation machinery that we're so lacking in this country, right? Because it's probably a tall order to ask a pre-market development program to answer all those questions, but they're relevant questions and they need to be answered. And I do think the FDA would be willing to put that evidence into labels were it generated in a reliable fashion. And so the hope is, by moving out into the community, by engaging these folks, by running much of the evidence generation off of the health record, which is going to take some more work, but it's getting increasingly possible, by the use of telemedicine and many of the other techniques we have, and doing more pragmatic trials, that we can generate this kind of evidence, which, the thing I didn't mention when I was just talking about all the reasons is trust. Now, there's a big erosion of trust in this country, and trust in experts, and trust in, pronouncements. And nothing, I think, builds trust more than collaboration and agency. If people who are sick want, many of them, to be in clinical trials and contribute to the generation of knowledge. And if you've experienced that and participated in it, then you have a much better understanding of what's happening and, some ownership over it. And so I think that really is also missing. If the evidence comes from the big medical center in the sky with experts, the trust, the same kind of ownership isn't there. So I think that's important too.
Yeah, it's different if your own doctor or your own healthcare organization was involved, which is certainly what we're aiming for. Well, I want to get to a couple of questions about how we get from here to there. And I want to start with steps on the regulatory side. So it's always easy to point to the other side of the fence as to why we're not in this more ideal world that we've all described, where we have trusted patient-provider relationships integrated into care for developing better evidence, a true learning healthcare system that's getting it right for people. Healthcare frontline providers these days, Janet, as you know, are busier than ever. They've had a really rough couple of years. And as we've gotten into this work, I've heard the litany of challenges in actually participating in research. And I want to get to some in a minute that are maybe problems outside of the FDA. And I appreciate your thoughts on that. But if we could start with some of the regulatory things that we've heard. Frontline clinicians are going to have a hard time collecting a lot of data. You mentioned for the recovery trial, blinding and double blind, placebo randomization, things like that. Those can be hard on the front lines. And I had not appreciated, Janet, just how much Form 1572 is something that frontline clinicians do not want to hear about.
Right.
What are the prospects for engaging on some of these regulatory issues that at least the perception out there is that they make it tough on frontline clinicians and clinical trials? Oh,
they're right. Okay, they're absolutely right. And don't forget, the clinical trial system and the good clinical practices were set up at a time when clinical trials were pretty bad. And so they put a lot of rigor in, and there's suspicion around trials that are conducted by sponsors, right? Because they have an obvious conflict of interest, right?
Yeah.
What we're talking about here is trials, particularly pragmatic trials done, as you said, as part of learning healthcare. They have a real different flavor. And generally speaking, probably where we already know something about the agent. It's not like we're just looking, we don't know whether it's going to cause, tremendous liver problems or something like that. So the FDA is, the Drug Center and Biologics are working, they're working on updating thoughts about distributed clinical trials, the forms, who needs to sign a form, and so forth. One of the COVID, there's some silver lining. It's been a terrible experience, but everybody's learned something. Look at how we've learned about coming into work.
Yeah.
Who would have thought that, right? So I think we've learned that telemedicine and remote visits and remote monitoring and all sorts of things are actually very feasible and can be done. And
Good to hear. And then I think to complement that, as you know, we have a lot of leaders in digital tools and digital science involved in this effort as well, with the goal, as you said, of making the data capture as automated as possible from electronic medical records, or ideally directly from patients. And as you said, COVID gave a push to those efforts. Any comments on prospects for reducing burdens through better digital science integration and tools?
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, we're continuing to collaborate on efforts to lift the outcome measures and observations and so forth directly off the electronic health record. I mean, why should we have two different records, especially if what we're trying to achieve here is integration of research and practice? We don't want to collect information that's irrelevant to practice in a pragmatic trial. Okay, it should be the information that's really important in that disease and care scenario. So that's what should be in a health record, in fact, although, as you know, it often isn't, or it isn't in some standardized way that we can use it, but we are working with people on that. So there is great hope that that will ease the burden as well, as to sort of do away with case report forms.
It sounds like another good area for engagement, but as you with FDA, but as you said in that last answer, in talking about the information that's in the electronic record, often it's designed for things other than capturing those outcomes and tracking those patients, for things like payment requirements, and can be very frustrating for clinicians too. So before we finish, I did want to ask your thoughts, Janet, about what changes you think would be most important outside of FDA to help drive progress on the ACT at point of care goals for practical, relevant, very inclusive and meaningful clinical trials. Most of the organizations, or I'd say all of the organizations we're working with, are in one way or another really committed to moving from fee-for-service, seeing lots of patients in a short period of time, towards more of a population focus in managing their patients' health and keeping them well over time. That shift seems to be helping. It certainly led to a lot of the motivation for trying to get these relevant questions on outcomes for different segments of the population answered. Other thoughts about what healthcare leaders can do to help make your job, to help make our collective job for advancing clinical evidence development better?
Well, I think there's a lot of movement all across society for diversity inclusion. And I think there's a realization that we have to move research out into the community, because, you could hit numbers on different groups included in your trial and have all the people be very affluent, very well off people, highly educated people, right? And we know the social determinants of health and where you live and what kind of care you get and everything are really important, and how much money you have and so forth. And so we really need trials to be representative. So there's a big push in that area. I think for healthcare systems, some larger demonstration projects around evidence generation, maybe collaborating with the agency and collaborating with each other, might be really useful, because to show this can be done. You know what I mean? Now the NIH collaboratory did some proof of concept work and showed it can be done. PCORNet is working on certain things like that, and we just need more examples, because meantime, many in the pharmaceutical area are working towards more diversity inclusion in their trials, and that means they have to look out toward the community. They have to involve community. They have to involve patients and so forth. So I think we're sort of triangulating and moving towards, and we need to have different experiments and demonstrations to show this can work.
And certainly the ACT at point of care, healthcare leaders and healthcare practitioners want to be part of that effort. Any final words for them as they try to, as ACT at point of care tries to add to that momentum that you've just described towards providing these clinical evidence platforms?
Yeah, well, I mean, as we've discussed, there are multiple different pain points that we need to work on. There's, can we run it off the electronic health record? Can the trials be simplified? Can you take relevant burning clinical questions that may be very important to your healthcare systems, and can you devise a large trial to answer that question? But then there's the, how do you engage the community? How do you engage the community practitioners? How do you support them? How do you train them? People are developing answers to all these things, but we need to try, and we need to keep doing experiments. And I think we will get better, and we'll look back and say, how could we have constrained the research enterprise to such a narrow segment?
Janet Woodcock, thanks so much for taking time to be with us, and we appreciate your ongoing leadership on advancing clinical evidence, and look forward to more opportunities to work together to fill these gaps.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. Take care.
Hi, everyone. Sorry for that slight delay while we resolved a few technical issues and moving from that recently recorded session with Janet Woodcock back to live action now. As you just saw in the last video, I'm Mark McClellan, the director of the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, and I'd like to add my welcome to all of you for the live portion of our event, building directly on the comments from Janet Woodcock. Before starting this session, just wanted to remind that I'm an independent director on the board of Johnson & Johnson Cigna Alignment Healthcare, in addition to my work at Duke Margolis. So let's build on Janet's comments that set the stage for today's meeting about the importance of the ACT and timeliness, the ACT at Point of Care Coalition's work. I'm joined here for this session by leaders from some of the healthcare systems and organizations that are part of this coalition. Again, all committed to driving progress to practically relevant evidence coming from routine frontline clinical practice, evidence that we need now more than ever. This effort is a complement to many ongoing activities to try to address evidence gap and improve care quality, but I think reflects the growing importance of better patient-specific relevant evidence for the healthcare systems across the United States and around the world, as we deal with, on the one hand, improved opportunities and treatments, but on the other hand, worsening or at least substantial gaps in health outcomes, and gaps that are particularly important for minority and other populations affected by health equity and health disparities. So there are many important questions that are hard to realize or address in the pre-market setting, as Janet described, but there are growing opportunities thanks to technologies, digital science progress, and just the commitment of healthcare organizations to improve quality outcomes and address unnecessary costs to fill in those gaps. So I'm very pleased to have, again, 3 leaders from ACT at Point of Care participating health systems, Dr. Kent Thielen, of the Mayo Clinic, Florida, who's CEO at the Mayo Clinic, Florida, Dr. JP Valen, who's Chief Clinical Officer at Intermountain Healthcare, and Dr. Tom Owens, President of Duke University Hospital and Senior Vice President of Duke University Health System. So if you all could come on video now, if you're not already, I'd like to start with some just initial comments, observations from each of you about the opportunities and challenges from where you sit to generate more evidence relevant to clinical practice and improving outcomes for the populations you serve. And Kent, do you mind if I start with you?
Sure, and good afternoon, everyone. And I just want to say thank you to the Coalition for Advancing Clinical Trials at the Point of Care and the Duke Margulis Center for Health Policy for holding today's meeting, which we really feel is an important meeting, and we're excited at Mayo Clinic to be a part of this effort. And back to your original question. So, what are some of the opportunities that exist from a health system perspective? Well, first, we recognize that we need to engage clinicians and patients in a broader and more diverse care setting. And really that'll ultimately allow us to have more diverse trial participants. We'll be able to address some of the issues related to technology to streamline and lower the barriers for enrollment to what we think really need to be well-designed clinical trials that are focused on meeting the needs of the patients in their particular communities. And as we think about that, we also need to think about ways that we can communicate more directly to our providers in the community. And so improving those communication pathways and engagement with really efficient dissemination of impactful, practical, what is really changing research in an ever more accelerated fashion so that those clinicians can utilize that information and ultimately have much lower thresholds for enrolling patients in clinical trials at the point of care away from our destination medical centers or academic medical centers.
Great, Ken, thanks for those comments. JP, could I turn to you next?
Yeah, thank you. And again, echoing Kent's gratitude for including us. This is such an important program and process to be able to get research and access to trials at the point of care. Similar to what Kent shared, as well as what you heard in the first segment, really the ability to get clinical care and clinical trials really across a broad geography is incredibly important to us. When we look at our organization, we cover a geography of about 630,000 square miles. And what we don't want is that the only access to care is if you live within a stone's throw of one of our large academic medical centers or tertiary centers. We want to have it be out there. The other piece that I would say is that we really want to make sure that we have access to trials that are answering questions that are really clinically relevant to our clinicians. And we're really excited about the concept of and kind of disseminating a lot more comparative effectiveness research of looking at two already approved and adequate and appropriate interventions or drugs for a particular condition, and the opportunity for us to be able to then say, is one incrementally better? Is it better for a specific population? If there are comparable outcomes, is there an ability to do it at a reduced cost? I think you've heard a lot of our organizations that are participating in the ACT point of care work are really focused on moving down the value stream, and that's going to be increasingly and more critically important to the work that we're doing.
Great, thanks, JP. And next, I'd like to turn to Tom.
Thanks, Mark. And again, I'll add my thanks, Mark, to you and the Margulis Center for really organizing this really important discussion and building on the comments of my colleagues. We all face some incredible challenges right now. I'll indicate, obviously, I don't need to tell this group that the last several years have been truly remarkable for so many reasons in healthcare and across our society. So as we think about how we meet the needs of our patients, understand the needs and the best way to deliver care, we now have to do that in an environment where many health systems, if not all, are facing staffing challenges. We have an overburdened and or burned out healthcare team. So as we think about how we can, again, develop the right evidence through well done and well organized clinical trials, we've got to lower the barriers for our healthcare team members and patients to participate in ways we probably haven't had to before because of the current resource challenges and the burnout and overburden among our team. And certainly the pandemic brought into very clear focus healthcare disparities, widening gaps in care in our communities, and the need to understand those more fully. And so I think now we're poised, based upon that experience, to really invest, as I know our colleagues at Intermountain Mayo, Duke, and others are doing, in understanding those disparities. Really a final comment there, that just as JP was saying, we have questions that we need answers to. It's in some ways a new form of sort of investigator-initiated research here, being driven by the needs of health systems and healthcare providers who need to understand how we improve the care we're delivering to close disparities and to succeed in an increasingly value-driven environment. So the time is now, and I'm excited about these discussions and how we can take some next steps to lower barriers, improve access to care, and to clinical data generation at the point of care across our broad geographic networks, so we're better able to serve our patients going forward.
I want to thank all of you for a very clear statement of the need and again, the very strong support for the active point of care mission. Now, in most of the rest of the day, we're going to be turning to what some of the early opportunities might be for developing this concept and expanding the ability to conduct clinical trials using platforms that are at the frontline point of care. I wonder if we could start, though, to tee that up with a few insights from you all about what you see as the biggest obstacles to participation. And you all hit on several of them. Number one, we have an exhausted and stretched healthcare workforce today. Number two, and Janet talked about these as well, maybe there's some barriers in terms of the administrative burdens and the like that are required or that seem to be required for participation. Anybody want to add to the what the barriers are? And then I want to turn to what we can do to address them.
Yeah, Mark, I think you highlighted a couple of them. We're obviously a highly regulated industry, and this is a place that is highly regulated for a good reason. As Janet shared, I mean, there's very clear reasons for being regulated. However, I think that those regulations may not necessarily reflect what is necessary to protect patients, but also to allow us to be doing the work that we need to do. I think, Janet highlighted that there is some need around FDA reform, probably CMS, as well as some element with OCR, the Office of Civil Rights. We are trying to, we obviously want to create access to trials for patients. But oftentimes, particularly as you get into the work around comparative effectiveness research, it is very much looking at two interventions that are already approved. And in the absence of a clinical trial, you have a provider at the point of care who is actually just making that decision in their head, and they don't know which intervention was the right one or not the right one. And that has persisted for forever through medicine. We have an opportunity to actually help to inform our providers so they're making a more informed decision. And so we've got to think about how to reduce the regulatory burden. You heard about the workforce challenges. I think everybody is feeling that. And I think that's a place that we need to double down on. However, I also think that this is one of those things that's a rejuvenating thing for our clinicians. You get clinicians to say, hey, we're going to reduce the burdens and actually let you get involved in research. That oftentimes is the type of thing that lifts people up. So I think the workforce and the state of the workforce is, I think, a double-sided coin. And I think we have opportunity to harness that.
Great. Tom, Kent, any additional comments on this?
I might just, go ahead. Go ahead, Tom.
No, I was going to JP had some really key points, and I was going to add one. Again, maybe this is unique to Duke, although I suspect not. We also have internal barriers in our complex academic environments, and we've found, as I've worked with Mark, Adrian Hernandez, others here, that there are some things we've been able to reevaluate and understand. How have we created roadblocks within, again, well-intended systems or processes or requirements in our complex environment. How can we lower some internal barriers also? And then secondly, something that JP said I think is so important is we believe, and we have found across our distributed network of primary and specialty care, that this is very energizing for our providers and our team members when we make this work in the right way. And particularly if the projects and the focus, the knowledge we're generating, they see a real value and need for. So not just bringing, engaging the providers in work that's meaningful in their practice, that they recognize will improve outcomes for their patients or their practice environment is really important. That's been a challenge for us because many times the areas of focus, the research projects that our team members and the community being approached with, they don't see the direct relevance for, or at least not the day-to-day relevance. So interjecting or introducing some of these topics that really they connect to with some passion helps create a platform for us to do more in these environments.
Yeah. And Kent?
I was just going to add, as we think about those clinicians who are working in the community, oftentimes there are significant barriers just because of the pace of the practice that they're dealing with. And so really lowering that threshold with enhanced technology. So we touched on earlier about the capabilities around digital and virtual options. And so making sure that we actively listen to them and translate some of those learnings that we have in more academic environments into the community practice, so that, for instance, the way they consent patients, the way they enroll patients, those types of things can really be streamlined and enable them to really have a low threshold to be able to participate and not significantly impact what in many cases are very high throughputs for patients.
Build on those comments and overcoming the barriers. You all mentioned some of them on the regulatory side. I think real and perceived, both from FDA standpoint, maybe OCR. And as Janet mentioned in her comments, Janet Woodcock mentioned, look, those regulatory structures are there for a reason. They're there to protect patients, to assure objectivity in the research, to assure that patients are well informed. But she also noted that many of those regulations have been around for quite a while. And I wonder if each of you could talk about how comfortable you feel as healthcare system leaders, where you're not just focusing on, okay, check the box, this patient came in for a visit and we sent the bill, but really focusing on the longer term well-being of those patients, a recurrent, as Janet said, trusted relationships with a patient population. How does that lend itself to, say, a revised regulatory structure where maybe not every individual physician would have to sign that Form 1572, but it could be part of a more systems approach? Are there steps that you all are confident about in your systems that could provide those kinds of regulatory assurances that traditional approaches have been designed to do, but updated to keep with the systems approach that I know all of you are emphasizing in your healthcare leadership? Anyone want to start?
Mark, I'm happy to, and I think you hit a little bit, or you're building a little bit on some of the comments I was making on our own experience, reflecting that the systems of care we put in, whether it's utilizing electronic health record resources, standard work and approaches across the organization, give us a level of comfort now that we may not have had in the past about how systematic our approaches could be across distributed sites. I always get nervous when someone asks if I'm comfortable about anything, because I think in healthcare right now we're pretty anxious in general. But yes, we have systems and processes in place across our distributed network that do give us more comfort that a patient's rights are protected, that we're following the standards and expectations required to do this work well. I still think we've got some real work to do as we think about the sort of phenotype of our community practices. And we talked about the time pressures a few moments ago. Those are very real in the environment. So when you're thinking about not just some of the steps we mentioned, like consent and patient education, engagement on research, but also data collection, validation, using the right tools. There's got to be real world solutions that work in an environment where the staffing challenges are not going to be relieved next week, probably not next year. And so they're going to have to be solutions that integrate into the flow of the practice and are highly reliable.
Yeah, and I think JP, you mentioned earlier about how digital technologies could potentially help the increasing sophistication, reliability of electronic data for supporting longitudinal care. That's something Janet Woodcock mentioned as well. Do you see that as part of the solution here?
Oh, absolutely. I think, as our entire industry is, moving towards digital, and that's got to be an increasingly critically important part of that. We also have to make it easy as, kind of building on what Tom talked about. I mean, we've got to make it easy at the point of care. And we always talk about how do we make it easy to do the right thing, difficult to do the wrong thing. How do we make it easy to actually enroll and engage patients? There's going to be some work through IT vendors, and we're all using some of the major systems. Those systems need to be able to pivot. We need to either design them internally or design them across, in collaboration with the IT vendors to say, how do we make it decision support appropriate and possible to get people in? How do we have those systems help with randomization if we need to, so that they can be doing that on the back end, so we have access to it. And then as we reach patients, across broad geographies, a digital telehealth component is going to be critically important to that. And I think everybody on this call is robustly engaging in that work, and we need to do more of that to make that successful.
And Kent Mayo as well is conducting, a large number of clinical trials, but I know in this effort to reach out to more of the community-based, very busy physicians, there are the challenges that we've discussed. Any additional comments that you might add from the Mayo perspective on how to make it easier for frontline clinicians to participate?
And I think first off, I just reflect on points from Tom and JP in that we've learned a lot the last 2 years with the capabilities with the virtual and digital environment. So many things that we had limiting beliefs around about what might be possible. We've moved way beyond that. The ability to care for patients in a hospital environment in their own home, the outpatient clinical visits. But I think a lot of that learning can be applied to the capabilities around clinical trials and how we might apply some of that capability, technology, and also putting aside some of those limiting beliefs about what's possible from a virtual standpoint. I think there are opportunities there. I think whatever we do from a regulatory standpoint, we have to be really careful that somehow we don't erode trust in those patients, in those communities. The trust is incredibly important. And having that trust, while virtual and digital capabilities will be important going forward, I think it's also important that we make sure that we find ways to also, and perhaps even more importantly, enhance our connectedness in those communities with those community providers. That requires some level of presence, whether it's virtual or actual physical presence. As an organization at Mayo Clinic, we've really stepped up our presence in the communities, our connectedness with churches, a more broader geographic presence away from our primary destination medical centers or academic medical centers. But we've tried to do that in a way where we're combining virtual capabilities and further building those strong relationships that we already had with community nonprofit organizations, the local community providers, but in a much more accelerated, broader way.
Yeah, and to that point about maintaining and building trust, I think that is, as Janet mentioned as well, one of the main advantages of trying to support meaningful clinical research through frontline providers is they already have those kinds of strong, trusted relationships. But this is an additional activity and involves, I think, JP, you mentioned that, look, for decades, research questions have evolved, questions where I guess, technically there's equanimity, not sure which treatment is really better than the other. But it is a different role for frontline clinicians to have that discussion or to be part of a system that's bringing that kind of research participation discussion front and center. We've talked about a lot of tools and resources, and we'll talk more later in this session about those, but would appreciate any additional thoughts and strategies that you all might have in mind for helping to maintain that patient trust as participation in a clinical research study might get to be a more routine part of routine care.
Mark, it's it is an incredibly important conversation. I think as health systems and everyone on in this call is focused on a longitudinal journey and being focused on population health and managing folks for a longer term journey. That requires trust, and we have to build that trust with patients and maintain that trust. That said, I do think it is a directed patient education around. Now, here's what it means to come to one of the participant organizations and others to receive care there. You have access to every bit of care at every location, and I think that's going to be a shift in sort of the value proposition that we share with patients, but I think is going to be one that's going to be engaging. I do think, though, we're going to have to make sure that we create, very clear kind of safeguards where patients who may not be as comfortable with it feel confident that they have opted out and they don't want to be a part of that, because we don't have the best track record in medicine in the last century around being transparent and kind of honoring kind of patient rights. And so I do think that's going to have to be a key part of that. If there's somebody who says, I want to opt out, how do we ensure that? But I think we're going to have a lot of people who are going to say, yeah, I want to opt in and I want to be in.
Tom, any thoughts on this topic and ways to connect and maintain or build patient trust in advancing these point of care research activities?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I think engaging the local providers and having them be capable agents in this work goes a long way to building trust with populations where they have long-term relationships or trust in a practice or a provider group. And we've certainly seen that in some of our rural practices and practices that care for historically marginalized populations. The cultural competencies of those practices really set you up to develop a relationship. But just as JP said, our responsibility is to make sure we're really delivering on every step of the way to make sure we don't undermine that trust in any way. The other counter is going to make it a little bit tangential to this. As I'm listening to the conversation, each of the organizations here, that we're representing are deeply involved in also continuous improvement work. And I think one of the other things that's important that does build trust at a local level with providers as well as with patients is that very transparent acknowledgement that we are working to continuously improve. And sometimes that takes the form of practice level improvement. Sometimes that might take the form of a pragmatic clinical trial. And sometimes that might be a true RCT, but it's all along that continuum of our commitment to discover new knowledge and improve care. And I think knitting it together in that way helps create a sense of understanding. And again, when the local team understands and feels that, they share that confidence and trust with the patients, which is, I think, really important.
Thanks. And Kent, any additional comments on maintaining and building patient trust and engagement in this work?
I think I touched on a number of points, but as I've thought about the conversation, clearly education of those involved in the community is really important, both the providers and the patients, and even beyond the patients or those who might be participating in clinical trials, their broader community and their families and everyone else. That really, I think, adds to their willingness to participate and really engage. And I also think that there's a strong interest and demand for this opportunity, but it needs to occur in a way where that trust exists and resources exist.
Thank you. And I'd like to pick up on Tom's comment about the potential alignment with efforts to understand and improve quality of care and needed access to care, which I know is also a challenge today and a big priority for all of you in leading healthcare organizations. I think this might help get at that issue of, frontline clinicians are very busy. They've got a lot of activities going on. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about potential synergies between initiatives where you all have done a lot of work to engage frontline clinicians around quality improvement and addressing gaps in care. Can that extend to gaining their engagement and maybe reducing the costs and burdens of participating in clinical research if the sort of the same outcomes that you're trying to improve are the ones that you're aiming to track with these practically relevant clinical studies? Does that help? Any comments on how this might fit with quality improvement and other major initiatives that you have underway to improve outcomes for the populations you serve?
I'll start, Mark, and just offer. I do think there is some real synergy there, and some of the, sort of the level of blocking and tackling you need to do to understand, processes and approaches, how you're capturing data, how you're delivering care in a specific population or disease state, set you up well then to build on top of that with, again, perhaps local level practice improvement, or where there's alignment, participation with a trial or clinical research. And we found in our experience that some of the practices that have really been out in front and developed those capabilities to look at their, develop standard work and build consistency in their practice are actually very well prepared then to participate in clinical trial work as well, because of those fundamentals that are in place. And I want to go back and echo Kent's comment about training. Perhaps in later groups you all could help us. What we don't need is more online training modules for people how to do research. We do need more realistic education for adult learners in busy practice that'll help set them up for success.
And embedded resources, yeah. Kent, JP, anything to add on this topic of aligning with quality improvement goals and support systems to help in frontline care participation?
Yeah, Mark, it's funny. I think it's a chicken and egg and yes and, right? You need a lot of the clinical improvement opportunities and work that's already been done has created a stable platform for us to be able to launch research activities in there. And so much of the work that we and everyone else is doing around the country is really around variation reduction, clinical and operational variation reduction, and trying to reduce variation to get to some level of improvement. Often the question comes up is, how do you know? How do you know that reducing it down to a single or reducing that variation is actually effective? And so I think there's an opportunity to actually do some of this point of care research to actually answer that question that helps to encourage and accelerate our clinical variation reduction work.
Now, we've talked a lot about some of the regulatory issues and how to address them. We've talked about digital tools and supports. We've talked about aligning with quality improvement activities. One other policy issue that we're going to get to a little bit later, and we've got Lee Fleischer, who's heads up quality activities and also evidence activities at CMS, joining us a bit later, is potential payer roles in helping with these activities. Now, payers, just like everybody else, they're stretched today, but they do seem to have some aligned interests around quality improvement and better evidence. Do you see some feasible ways to maybe align some of the clinical trial frontline implementation work that we'd like to do with the relationships and issues that you all are facing with the payers involved in your systems? I know for each of you, to some extent, you're the payer yourself. You're covering, you're taking on risk for some parts of your population at least. But would appreciate any thoughts before we wrap up on potential synergies with health insurers, with healthcare payers, both public and private in this work.
Mark, I think every big problem or big issue in healthcare has to be solved in collaboration between, providers, physicians, providers, and insurers. And so I do think that there is a role for the payers to be a part of this, either encouraging the work. Are there some reimbursement models that could be effective? That could help with this potentially. And I think that's obviously a complex conversation to have. But if to do things right and for us to really kind of solve a lot of the challenges in healthcare, we all have to be aligned, and I think are in many ways all aligned in how do we deliver the best care for patients, and how do we learn from what's happening so that we're continuing to improve that care that's being delivered. So we all ultimately have an interest in it, and we've got to solve it together.
Tom, Kent, any additional thoughts about payers? I mean, it does seem like the whether it's to pick up on JP's comments, whether it's gaps that we're still seeing in COVID-19 outcomes, or the worsening trends in many cases in cardiovascular outcomes or other conditions, it seems like there might be some opportunities to align.
I would just briefly add that, I think as long as the value equation makes sense with the providers, they're open and willing to have that conversation. I think that in many cases, we've enhanced our communication pathways and engagement with the providers after everything that's happened over the last couple of years with COVID. And as we've rolled out more virtual capabilities for outpatient visits, home hospital, those types of things. And so building upon those relationships might allow us to further accelerate our capabilities in this arena. And the other thing is many of the payers are now also becoming providers or participating in that arena more and more. So I think they may have more openness to that engagement.
Some alignment on the outcome and total cost of care goals. Tom?
Yeah, I'd agree with what my colleagues have said, and would only add that, we've certainly seen some challenges in addition to the collaboration that's just been described. We've seen some challenge around rigidity and medical policy and some of the other approaches. And I think as we're trying to answer important questions that have impact for our community, our patients, for the payers and providers, it would be great to engage in some conversations about how we might create some flexibility in certain areas as it may relate to medical policy changes they could make to allow us to answer some of these questions, and still be reimbursed for the care that we're delivering as we do so. And I think that would be a great area to explore more.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all for a great discussion. In our last minute or two, any maybe a final thought from each of you about the path forward from here on improving clinical trials and relevant evidence at the point of care? Maybe JP, could I start with you?
Sure. No, I mean, this is incredibly important work. I think one of the things also we learned from COVID was the ability to expand who's involved in this. And we used our antibiotic stewardship pharmacists actually to be co-investigators. So the only other thing that I would throw out is, we should keep an open mind to who else can be a part of advancing this work.
Great. A great comment. And Tom?
Yeah, I'll just say let's take a lot of the lessons learned during COVID, how rapidly we were able to adapt and change and take advantage of technology and approaches. And if there's a positive about what we've just been through, we've learned a lot about how we can work together and make a meaningful difference for patients. It's another great opportunity now to carry that work forward as we approach answering important questions at the point of care.
Great, thank you. And Kent, you're going to get the last word for this session.
Just to build on my colleagues' comments, I just say, again, from everything we learned from the COVID pandemic, we were able to pivot to new ways of working much more quickly. And I'd love to see this effort that we're starting now with the coalition to move in a much more accelerated fashion than what we may have thought possible, in years past. So very exciting to see where this will all go.
Great. Well, again, thank you all for taking the time, and thanks especially for the commitment to drive this transformation. Healthcare organizations really want to see better outcomes for their patients. There are too many gaps today. Really want to see opportunities to avoid unnecessary costs, and it's great to have you all involved in helping to lead this effort for transformation in clinical evidence. And just to keep up that pace, just picking up on Kent's last comment, what could really drive more progress is seeing a path to addressing an important unmet evidence need through this kind of approach. And that's what we're going to focus on in the next session. So for that, I'm very pleased to turn to my colleague, Adrian Hernandez, to moderate the next session this afternoon. Adrian?
All right. Well, thanks, Mark. What a great panel. I just have to say, feel very inspired. And also, I'll just say a call to action here in terms of what we should be doing going forward. And so as we learned here at the beginning of this, and also going back to the origins of ACT at POC, is that really everyone's developed this concept that there are many different areas that we can focus our efforts on. We've learned a lot through the pandemic, the will to do so, and what can be done. And then I think as we go forward is really the questions are, how should we focus on other areas? What can we take forward in terms of the lessons learned from COVID-19 what we can do for other areas, as well as to be prepared for any future pandemics. Both in the discussion with Janet and Mark, outlining different examples, both in the US with Active 6 and also similar trials, and also the UK experience, we know it's possible. And it's also important to actually build out capabilities that can be continuously generating evidence and being faster in terms of responding to emerging or important public health conditions and problems that we have today. There's been many examples of that we've heard about in the past. As a cardiologist, I certainly can note that cardiovascular disease remains a leading cause of death, and the evidence that's needed is badly needed, and clinicians are very motivated to do so. And so as we think about point of care trials and approaches, what are the ways that we can do something different, perhaps better, faster, and even cheaper in conducting value-based research and development and generating evidence that can be actionable for healthcare systems, regulators, and others for optimizing treatments and improving health. So I'm really pleased today to be joined by a great panel of experts, and we'll introduce them here. So we have Carrie Wolowitz, who's from the Office of Science and Technology and Policy. We have Kimberly Sharetta, who's from the Launch Office Branch Chief within the Division of Research, Innovation, and Ventures, derived from BARDA. We have David Sergel, who's the Global Head of Cardiorenal Metabolic and Development at Novartis. And Owen Gurick, who's the Chief Medical Officer at the CVS Health Clinical Trials Services, and Sam Brown, who's the Director of the Center for Humanizing Critical Care at Intermountain Healthcare. So thanks for joining us here. Each of our panelists will give some brief introductory remarks, and then we'll dive into a discussion with questions that have come up already, and questions from you all. So first, let me turn to Kim to give her point of view. Kim.
Sure, thank you. For those that are not familiar with BARDA, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for including me on this panel so I can share some of our perspective on point of care clinical studies for pandemic preparedness. So as mentioned, I'm the branch chief of the launch office within BARDA's DRIVE division. And DRIVE was established in 2018 to bring technical and business innovation to BARDA's mission. If you're not familiar with BARDA, BARDA is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. We sit within the ASPR, which is the Assistant Secretary Preparedness and Response within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, so HHS. And we have the authority to really bring forward and develop and procure medical countermeasures for CBRN threats, pandemic influenza, and emerging infectious diseases. And we've been actively engaged with the COVID-19 response. So my office specifically has been thinking about the host response to infections and diagnostics that are based on that host response. So these may be biomarkers, physiological measurements, clinical data. We also are interested in host-directed therapeutics. So anything that can really modulate the host response. So my perspective here will be how we have thought about some of these approaches in terms of pandemic preparedness, and how we really need to, how we're always thinking about how to match the right product with the right patient and ability to access that patient in the right clinical setting. Not all of the products that we're developing are for use in the hospital or your traditional physician's office. And so we're thinking about how do we continue to access these patients. A little bit of background about some of our experiences, and then I'll make sure to pass off to the other panelists. So as part of the pandemic response, we stood up a program called the Rapidly Deployable Capabilities Program. And this was really to pilot some adjunctive diagnostic technologies. And this was to support all the critical countermeasures we were already doing in BARDA. So in addition to the pathogen-specific diagnostics and vaccines and therapeutics. And the goal was to see if we could rapidly deploy these, and if they would have impact on empowering patients and empowering healthcare providers during the response. And the goal was to target patients before they had severe illness. So this meant accessing them in these pre-hospital settings. So we focus on these host-based technologies. They were meant to be agnostic to any threat. And these were in vitro diagnostics, for instance, that could help triage patients that may need escalated care, digital diagnostics that could evaluate patient data from an EHR, or even wearables, watches, patches that could inform on patient status in terms of their risk of infection or their risk of health deterioration. This could help them ascertain whether they need to stay home and isolate or quarantine, especially before we had pathogen-specific approaches. So one of the lessons learned from development of these technologies was the ability to truly identify the right patient population, enroll them, especially when these patients are not going to the clinical sites for enrollment, those centralized sites, or going to the hospital, and making sure we're accessing the patients that were at high risk that we wanted to be monitoring. So we recently launched an initiative and released an RFI that just closed a couple of weeks ago on establishing a decentralized clinical studies and healthcare delivery model network to address some of these challenges that we had faced. So I will pause there and turn back, I guess, to the moderator. Thank you.
Right. Kim, thanks a lot. So let's next turn to Carrie. And so Carrie, obviously there's been a lot of interest in terms of White House Office of Science and Technology in terms of what we need to be doing in the context of the pandemic and beyond. So always being prepared seems like a lesson learned. So Carrie, what are your thoughts in terms of thinking about these forward-looking steps in terms of optimizing the clinical research enterprise?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the invitation. I'm quite energized by the conversation so far. You know, the Biden-Harris administration has been very focused on pandemic preparedness and thinking about what capabilities do we need to bring forward for the future, and what are the lessons that we've learned from COVID-19. And you've heard about some of these already from Janet, from our colleagues in the healthcare world. Kimberly just mentioned some, and it really is about you know, taking the lessons that we learned from being forced to innovate very rapidly in a real world environment in which the, you know, bright, clear lines we sometimes think about between the research enterprise, the healthcare system, and the public health enterprise were entirely blurred. And we were really launching a learning system to do research in real time. And I think, as Janet mentioned, in many cases that didn't work really well. We didn't have the capabilities really set up for that kind of innovation, but we learned as we went, and it got better. And we do have some examples, as you've just mentioned, to point to. A lot of what we're thinking about in preparedness is how do we create the infrastructure, the investments in terms of both people and technologies and regulatory streamlining to be better prepared and more agile as a system. And clearly point of care clinical trials are an excellent example of a much more agile approach in the face of an emerging outbreak of disease, for example. And, you know, when I think about some of the capabilities that we want to carry forward, some have been mentioned already. You know, this relationships that we've built on the community front with community groups, and all that we've learned about with engagement in helping to build trust, you know, the utilization of community health workers, you know, thinking outside the box of how we use data system and electronic health records, a lot of potential lessons which we can transform into capabilities going forward so we can be ready to activate on a dime. But part of that is going to be exercising those capabilities for non-pandemic use in the meantime to really, you know, activate the whole system in the interpandemic periods.
Great. Thanks, Carrie, for those opening comments. So next, let's turn to Dave. So you know, a lot of the limitations of what we can do is not necessarily the pipeline, understanding biology and pathophysiology of disease, but actually developing it and understanding where it works and where it doesn't. The examples just during the pandemic are incredible in terms of what people were able to do. I mean, who would have imagined developing vaccines and timelines that are measured by months as opposed to years? So now the challenge, as you are taking on cardiovascular health, what are you thinking about in terms of how to translate this in terms of cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, Adrian, thanks to you and Mark for setting up a great meeting and some really interesting discussions. I really found it energizing. So just to make a couple of additional comments beyond what has already been mentioned, we all know that the introduction of new medicines for cardiovascular disease can have a very slow ramp, as Dr. Woodcock mentioned. And so what we've been thinking about is how we can partner with healthcare systems and with patient organizations and practitioners to generate the type of data that would make a new product more accessible to patients when it's approved. And the question, as was raised by Dr. Woodcock earlier, is, can we actually incorporate endpoints within our development programs that are more meaningful to those key stakeholders, so that when that medicine's ready to be approved, that patients can actually get access to it, and we can have the impact that we want to with these new medicines. So our goal is to partner with these stakeholders to better understand their needs and to try to reflect key stakeholders' needs within our clinical trials. So it's a little bit different than when we think about running phase 4 trials or studies after a drug's approved. Even during the development process, when we're first learning about a medicine, there is an opportunity to answer some of those key questions. Which patients will benefit? How does a drug behave in certain drug combinations, et cetera, in commonly used medicines in cardiovascular disease? So we think we have an opportunity to really fill out those evidence gaps more effectively during the development phase. And as you said, Adrian, I mean, the time is now, right? We've already seen what can be achieved, through the COVID pandemic, and we've seen, how COVID has uncovered the health disparities and the additional risks from cardiovascular disease that when those risk factors go uncontrolled. So I think the time is really now. The last thing I'll say is I was really inspired by this concept of the future state of having a healthcare system at the ready to adopt a clinical trial and being able to drop a new medicine into the healthcare system and generate evidence rapidly. I do think that there are incremental innovations that we need to make in the meantime, right? So we can't go from today's randomized controlled trials to that future state in one, time warp leap. I think we need to make some incremental innovations and do more experimentation like Dr. Woodcock mentioned. But I'm really excited to be part of the panel, so thank you.
Absolutely, got great comments there. So Dave, thanks for that. And Owen, let's go to you next. So I'm often reminded by Janet's discussion about how we need to get closer to the community, that there's so many people who live in healthcare deserts or clinical trial deserts. And what you all have been doing at CVS is really trying to broaden the participation and crossing or filling in those deserts. So what are your thoughts on these issues here, and specifically around being ready for the next pandemic and also in, say, cardiovascular disease?
Sure. Well, Adrian, really do appreciate the opportunity. Just to level set for everyone at CVS, we launched our clinical trials business a little over a year ago, and we're in essence in the community, right? You've hopefully all shop at CVS, and if you get prescriptions, I hope you get your scripts filled there. So you can come into CVS for obviously prescriptions, consumer goods. We have minute clinics, so acute care, and we're converting many of those minute clinics to research sites. So they're GCP trained providers, and our providers are nurse practitioners and PAs, right? In the community, live and work there, reflect and look like the community that we serve, right? So as we think through, and the mission here, frankly, is to make research part of a patient's everyday life, right? So they can come into a store, get a script, get some chips, get some healthcare, and also participate in research, right? So just really part of the everyday mindset. And as we do that, we do have this, we think we're going to attract and enroll a broad variety of Americans, like everyday Americans. So folks that can't necessarily go into large academic research sites or medical centers, but can go to where they shop and live and participate in research. So we think the evidence that you can generate from that sort of experience will be much more generalizable. And for us, our providers in the clinics, the research sites are not physicians; they are nurse practitioners and PAs, I mentioned. So a lot more of them. We do have the PI oversight. We talked a little bit about earlier, Dr. Woodcott and Mark, about the 1572. Right, so we do have PIs that do oversight, but one PI might manage or oversee 5 or 6 locations and he or she delegates responsibility to the sub-investigators. So the ability to have this community setting, as I mentioned, we think and we feel we reduce obstacles in terms of access, we reduce obstacles in terms of trust, because the providers and the research staff look like and reflect the community. And then if we're successful in terms of overlaying the right messaging, we can get some really good and diverse participation, and not just a recruitment, but long-term retention. And as we think through, the business was really launched as a function of CVS's participation in the COVID studies for recruitment. So early on, there was a lack of diversity in many of the COVID studies. We came on board and given, just the diverse locations and our diverse patient set, were able to recruit for those studies that, populations that reflect all of America. And so we think that is really the beauty. And when our providers do things like phlebotomy, we're rolling out EKG to get into cardiovascular studies. And getting back to the COVID response, one of the beauties of our platform, and we published on this, we looked at breakthrough infections. So CVS was doing both the testing as well as the vaccination. So you didn't have to rely on patient-reported outcomes. So you knew who got tested, you knew when they tested positive, and you knew when they got vaccinated and which vaccine they took, right? So that was, we think, was a very real-world experience. So actual patients, as I mentioned, everyday Americans that are participating in research. And that's what we're looking to do, like I mentioned, making research part of a patient's everyday life. And we think, and thus far, we've been able to recruit much more diverse populations, and populations that have been historically underrepresented in research.
Great, and certainly like the comments you made about, say, broadening our kind of mindset in terms of who can participate in research, especially in terms of investigators. JP brought that up in the last conversation. Like, some of the people who are interacting with patients every day aren't so-called the elite PIs, so to speak. Actually broadening our sense of who are PIs, the pharmacists and the nurse practitioners, PAs, that certainly are qualified for having those roles. And likewise, you see that in the community with all the CVSs around every corner. So let's turn next to Sam. And so Sam, I'll just note for the audience here, this is one of the few times where we haven't had to call in from the ICU. And so you have the lived experience and help remind people what it's like to be a clinician trying to do both excellent clinical care and research embedded in that. So what are your perspectives, Sam, on these two areas?
Yeah, thanks so much, Adrian, and thanks everyone for convening and gathering. I always learn when I get together with y'all, and I'm excited to see the directions we're going. I think a touch of history is helpful. Intermountain is really well known for high value, highly efficient clinical care, and I think is well known as well justly for its quality improvement scope. It's a routine part of the way the organization functions and has been for decades. What I think historically has been less known and is now better known after the pandemic is that starting in the 1970s, Intermountain funded an academic core within its large clinical enterprise, and that group has grown steadily but remains a core rather than being a traditional academic medical center. And that's meant that there have been real strengths, such that when the COVID pandemic came, We had our traditional quality improvement. We rapidly developed risk predictor scores that we immediately implemented to help to manage patients. We spun up a hospital at home and remote patient monitoring systems quickly. We were able to use a robust telemedicine infrastructure, both for clinical care and for research. But crucially, we were also able to answer some of the panic in our local society with careful, compassionate reason. And I think many of us on the call remember spring of 20, when there was a lot of interest in hydroxychloroquine. Well, you may not know, although you may have followed, there was a New Yorker piece about it, was that there was a complicated criminal conspiracy, in retrospect, to make hydroxychloroquine available in Utah without a prescription. And when we got that news, our chief medical officer reached out to us and said, what do we do with this mayhem? And in 14 days, we were able to deliver, as a research enterprise, a randomized controlled clinical trial, pragmatic, locally implemented using hospitalists, advanced practice clinicians, and crucially, antimicrobial stewardship pharmacists, who are absolutely fantastic as site investigators, and we're able to dovetail it with a large national placebo-controlled trial so that the data could enter into a living meta-analysis. And I think that casting of having an academic core working within a large clinical enterprise to allow us to do service to the community is crucial to the reframing. And from that reframing, I think has come the realization that trials are not about scientists exploiting vulnerable people. There have been horrifying examples of that in the past, but those are rare, memorable, because they're so awful, but quite rare instances. There are, although we live in a capitalist society and our industry partners do sell the drugs they prove to work, fundamentally, trials are a response when standard care fails a patient. If your medical problem is not resolved by standard care, you have roughly three options. You can go get some snake oil, and there's plenty of that. You and your doc can just make something up and hope for the best, or you can enter a clinical trial. And we think that clinical trials are the safest and best ways, personally, to respond. So I think that framing is crucial to activating the clinicians, to activating the patients, and to making research work. Thanks, back to you.
All right, thanks so much, Sam. So we'll get started with some general questions here for the panel. And so each of you bring different perspectives from developing and coordinating policies to implementation to developing drugs to developing new models of research and also delivering care and also embedding research. So what are some of the key issues or considerations for operationalizing point of care? Like we are really interested in going from theory to application. So what are the big issues if you had a magic wand? So I'll let anyone start off here.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think one of the issues, and Adrian, you mentioned this, right, is who's considered a PI, right? From a reg perspective, NPs and PAs and pharmacists certainly can, but from an industry acceptance perspective, we're always looking for the physician. So thinking through, especially in this decentralized fashion, how many sites can a PI oversee, right? Can you do that across state lines? And I imagine that's very different for a flu study versus a late stage lung cancer study. So those are some of the operational considerations that we've been thinking through. And frankly, I know Pam from Medical's on later on doing some, looking at doing some research together to evaluate what are some of those factors, because the real issues are, one, ensuring patient safety and data quality and integrity.
Actually, so Owen, that's a great point. And just in terms of some of the things that we're aiming to do here are across all 50 states and maybe even beyond. But some of the kind of regulations have been made for states. So especially as you're trying to get to more direct to participants studies or decentralized studies, the state boundaries may be a little bit artificial here. What are other considerations, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to chime in. I mean, I think the last statement around scientific rigor and quality are two things that are you can't compromise on. Those are kind of the foundation of trust in the clinical research system. So they have to be, you know, sacrosanct. But I start one level up with sort of a discussion about what the need is for the clinical trial. So to the scientific rigor question, you know, making sure that what's being addressed is something that's going to be important to patients or key stakeholders, and that it's actually going to inform patient care. So I think that it's not really an operational piece, Adrian, but it's a crucial piece that we get right from the very beginning, because it really creates a foundation for future work together and for ultimately having patient impact. I guess the second thing I'd say, more from an operational standpoint, is not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So to my earlier point about experimentation, we know there are a lot of challenges around data quality, data collection, the EHR, et cetera. You know, lots of challenges there. The question is, what can we do today? You know, to your point, Adrian, how can we put one foot in front of the other and actually embark on the journey to bring healthcare systems and practitioners in the community into clinical research? And I think there are ways where we can do that don't necessarily require us to solve all the problems from the very beginning.
Yeah. Dan, I'm glad you mentioned the quality aspect here, because I was going to ask you is just collecting more data inherently give you better quality answers?
Are you asking that to be argumentative, right? No, yeah. Actually, the less data you collect, probably the better quality you get at the end of the day. You know, so there are fewer data. If there are fewer data points to collect, it obviously is easier to clean the data and ensure that those pieces of information that you're collecting meet certain levels of rigor. But you know, I think with the newer mechanisms around how we can, you know, ingest large quantities of data, those issues around monitoring and data quality can be solved at a larger scale. I don't know that we're fully there yet. There are probably other experts on the call who would know better than I. But you know, again, I think that there are certainly incremental advances that we can make that will really push this effort forward.
Right. Carrie, any perspectives on what you've seen, learned on operationalizing this across the different systems?
Yeah, I think you know, thinking through some of the places where we have seen friction points and being thoughtful about how we remove those friction points. So, for example, making sure we do the advanced work and relationship building on, as Janet mentioned, governance structures and master agreements, so that, you know, before you try to dive into the trial, that you've had the conversations with the partners that you need to about things like data use and data resources might be one way. You know, I love David's comment about not letting perfect be the enemy of the good, because I think that is exactly right. You can begin to make incremental changes and use the tools you have while learning where the need for improvement of those tools are. I think, you know, if we look at data systems, for example, you know, I come from the world of NIH, where we spent many years talking about interoperable data systems and you know, how do we integrate research data systems with clinical data systems, and we spun our wheels for a really long time, and then COVID came and we had to do that overnight. It turns out that a lot of things that we made overly complicated, when push came to shove, we were able to find solutions, and I think that is sort of the cultural attitude you need to bring to this is how do you come up with the seemingly simple solutions that can begin to move us in these incremental ways towards a more integrated system.
Great. Kim, any perspectives from what you saw in terms of what's really needed to operationalize point of care trials?
And not necessarily a point to operationalize, but a point I think to take into consideration with design is the user, right? So we think about clinical trials for medical products in terms of the safety and the efficacy, but the user is so important to ensure appropriate adoption and implementation of those products in the long run. And, you know, if we think about patients at home or who are bedridden, or pediatric patients who have caregivers or parents, making sure that we're bringing them into the equation of these study designs and getting their feedback in assessing products is very critical.
Great. Let me move on to another area, and I'll start with Sam first, and others can chime in though. But so we've talked a lot about, you know, kind of the unmet need in terms of generating answers. You gave an example nicely of what Intermountain did to kind of step up to the plate, so to speak, regarding the early days in the pandemic. So what's needed to align clinical practice with clinical research? What are key things there? Let's see.
Yeah, and I seem to be having some Wi-Fi difficulties. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Your video is not working, but maybe if you want to go off your video.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm not sure what's going on with the Wi-Fi. I think
we're still having problems, Sam. So if you come off your video and we can
need to simplify the regulatory oversight of clinicians.
We may need to move
carve outs for.
I think we're still having problems here, Sam. So let's see if you work off your without your video. Does it work?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not sure what's going on in the land of wireless signals. Are you able to hear me now?
Yeah.
I think maybe move on, and I'll keep trying to fix this.
All right, let's go on to some other areas. So there are a few questions that came in through the chat, and just I'll make these a little more generalizable because I think they have broad implications here. So one is, you know, certainly there's some agreement in terms of like, hey, we need to broaden out the reach for participation in clinical trials. Owen, you suggested a kind of model in terms of where you all are going in terms of CVS activating in this area. What do you think is needed to kind of show that the same quality data is coming from those areas, or that type of model versus so-called, I'll just say, the traditional site-based research trials where a sponsor has like a checklist for feasibility that's 100 pages long, and you have had to done clinical trials for 20 years to be part of it. So what are your thoughts there? And we'll get Dave to also respond to this.
Sure. So adoption, like a lot of new approaches, is part of the challenge, right? So one of the things we plan to do is, and with our sponsor partners, is just evaluate that question around data quality, right? So we can, you know, do we have comparable rates of queries and responses to queries? Are they closed out at, you know, the same amount of time? That's on the data end. You know, what would drive the data and the evidence is, you know, can we retain and recruit in similar timelines or better? And then, you know, the most important thing from a patient safety perspective, Are we seeing any differences in adverse events or serious adverse events, and probably most importantly, the follow-up to those events, because they will occur in a remote setting as well as any other setting. So those are some things we're going to track. And when we're at the beginning of maybe the middle of the beginning of the adoption curve. And those are the things that those data elements within the clinical trial are things we'll look to measure and hopefully see some pretty similar, if not improved performance there.
And Dave, I'll let you answer the same question in terms of like as a sponsor. I mean, I'm sure you have like different pitches of grand solutions, and how will you all make ultimate decisions on the comparative effectiveness essentially of different models, or when they would work?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Owen outlined is perfect. I mean, that's really what we would be looking for. Of course, you're also looking for sensitivity analyses on efficacy. So it's, of course, adverse events and tolerability as well as queries, et cetera, follow up. I mean, those are all crucial. The other thing I think that's important to mention is that it depends on what stage of development or marketing the drug is. If you have a medicine that's already been on the market and has been on the market for a long time, you can't compromise on quality, but you can evaluate that medicine more easily, probably in a real world setting or in a community setting, as Dr. Woodcock mentioned earlier, versus when you're thinking about a phase 2 or phase 3 medicine where the product doesn't have a label yet. You don't know fully the risks and benefits of that medicine, and it would be a bigger challenge. So I think there isn't necessarily a difference in terms of the requirements for quality, but the opportunities to do exploration and assure that the quality is good in a community-based setting is probably easier to do with a marketed product than it is with a development product.
And Adrian, if I could add to that,
yeah.
I think it's important as we shift to a world that we all aspire to, with more inclusivity and greater diversity in our clinical trials enterprise, is to recognize, sort of the biases built into the system and the assumptions related to quality. I think there is a bias in the clinical trials enterprise towards academic medical centers, for example, under this sort of assumption that there's a greater capacity and quality. And I think those are the assumptions we need to challenge. I'm not suggesting, anybody can do a clinical trial. I do think there are a minimum level of capacities you need, but I think we also need to make sure that we're not using quality arguments or proxies for quality in a way that actively works against the sort of inclusive model that we're trying to achieve. And part of that is stopping for a moment and recognizing what different actors are bringing to the table, and really making sure that we are checking our own biases.
Yeah.
Can I jump in again? It's such a crucial point. It's actually why I loved Owen's framework about how he described what, tangibly what quality looks like. When he was talking about tangible outcomes and tangible metrics. I think it's also crucial then to also consider the discussions up front about quality. So you design into your trial quality metrics that are reasonable for the type of trial that you're conducting. So to your point, Carrie, your investigators and your sites are going to have some impact and influence on how quality is measured in your study.
Yeah.
And this is Stan. I think I've solved my AV problems. I totally agree with what's being said. And my thought is that what interferes with that kind of inclusion and responsiveness to the needs of patients is anxiety about breaking rules that people don't know. So I think if there were a way to have, for example, 4 or 5 different kinds of trials and again, there's the early stuff, there's the pre-phase 3, phase 3, and then there's the post-phase 3 as an example. If there were a way to get alignment across the many different US government agencies that might have a hand, it's not just FDA, it's also OCR, for example, that people are just worried, they want to do right by their patients, they also don't want to break any rules. And so I think if there were a simple package that said, these are the kinds of investigators that can be involved. This is the replacement for the 1572 or the regular 1572. This is the degree to which it can be low touch or no touch, just broadly speaking, so that people could say, oh, I got a pragmatic trial that's going to reach communities of color because it's not wedded to the large academic medical centers or the CRO sites. We can proceed. Everybody's signed off broadly. This is the kind of thing. I think that improved communication and modularity from the diffuse regulatory side would really help that effort over.
Thanks, Sam. So I think Carrie and Dave, I think a theme that you're also bringing is, fit for purpose, that it's not one size fits all. And the kind of depending on the context, whether the health condition, the medical product, and the stage of learning or evidence generation around the medical product, we should be thinking about where these broader efforts can take place. Certainly, there's many more people, many more places that would be interested in participating if the structural barriers weren't in place or biases that we may have. Sam, since your audio is working, I want to return back to the alignment of clinical practice and clinical research. Since you have that direct lived experience on a frequent basis, can those two worlds coexist? Can they even be one world? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I did it myself, and then I worked with our teams of investigators here at Intermountain to implement it. And what helped, honestly, was that NIH was able to provide better capitation expenses and also the flexibility so that I could buy time for my investigators, so they knew that they were getting time bought for them. And then we worked with them to integrate it into their clinical rounding. And they increasingly, I think, saw the research coordinators as clinical assistants. And they really rallied around the notion that if standard care is not enough, what's the next piece? My personal sort of dream is, why can't you have CME credit for being an investigator on a trial? Like, why do we not give CME credit for that? What are the other ways to make people's lives easier if they're willing to go the extra step to deliver next level clinical care, which includes trial options for people failed by usual care? Over.
All right, well, thanks. So we're about to finish our session here. And so let me turn to our panelists to give a few closing comments on what needs to be considered next. I'll start with you, Carrie.
Well, just an opportunity to touch on one thing that we haven't raised in this particular conversation is, in the wake of COVID and, as part of our thinking going forward in preparedness, our country has made an incredible investment on the community level, in community health workers and community-based systems. We haven't talked as much about sort of the role of community health workers in the clinical trial, but it's an important component to think about as we think more broadly and inclusively about how we integrate healthcare and clinical research, because there are enormous unexploited opportunities there as well, and particularly in communities that are underserved by the research enterprise. And so just wanted to make sure we didn't lose that segment of the healthcare system.
All right, quickly, Dave.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Thanks again, Adrian. This is really an interesting conversation. I wanted to pick up something from the previous panel, and that was that investigators are likely to be really excited to participate in the development and discovery of new medicines. And I really latched onto that because, I think there are logistical hurdles for sure. We've talked about several of them. And I think we don't want to let that excitement dwindle. I think there's an opportunity to really engage people in the discovery and development process and really create, better impact for our innovative therapies in the future through these partnerships. So thanks again for the opportunity.
All right, Kim.
Yeah, I'll just touch on that. I think there's great opportunity right now. We do need to continue to innovate and iterate upon what we are learning from existing clinical studies, but where clinical healthcare is shifting and pivoting towards more patient-centric care and use of novel models like telemedicine and non-traditional settings, I think there's just a great opportunity for us to tap into that as we think about clinical trial design in the future. Thanks.
Owen.
Yeah, I would just add that, it's implied in terms of the members of the coalition, but it's going to be a group effort, right? So you think about folks like CVS or FQHCs that have footprint in the community. We're not going to be doing viral sequencing or endoscopies, right? So we're going to have to pair up and match and frankly, maybe even design a trial where you can have a patient can decide that they're going to go to Intermountain one visit and a CVS location for visit 6. So working with the sponsors very early on in trial design to make this a reality.
I love it. Personalized protocols. Sam, last word.
A buddy of mine said when you're starting with a new ethical regulatory framework, you want to start with innocuous, simple, unobjectionable, plain Jane vanilla questions. And I think that's right. I think as we're sorting this out, we don't want anything that's going to feel scandalous or controversial. Simple, straightforward trials, get experience with them, and then start pushing into the phase 3 space, for example. That's my intuition. Start with benign, simple kinds of questions and expand out. Over.
All right, great. So hopefully a few layups here coming our way. All right, well, hey, thanks everyone for such a great discussion here. So we do need to go ahead and move on. And so I'm happy to turn it over to Brian Anderson from MITRE to lead our next discussion. Brian.
Great, thanks, Adrian. And it's a pleasure to help be the moderator for our next session, session 3, utilizing digital tools to increase efficiency. As Dr. Halamka noted in his welcome remarks, one of the key pieces of ACT at POC's work is developing digital tools to increase efficiencies in things like trial execution, reduction in cost, and to bring a greater level of equity and diverse representation of patients included in the actual research itself. These are some of the promises that are included in the digital tools that one of our working groups within ACT at POC is beginning to make progress in. I'm Brian Anderson. I'm MITRE's Chief Digital Health Physician. I'll be your moderator for this next panel. In this session, we'll dive into what we're thinking about in the context of focus areas that Adrian in the last panel just discussed. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So when we think about the clinical trial life cycle, and Adrian, I shamelessly lifted some of these concepts from some prior work that you've done. They're easily kind of carved out into several areas. So you have pre-study planning, study setup, recruitment, study conduct, regulatory reporting and approval, and post-market surveillance and evaluation. When we think about the kinds of tools that can overlay those areas, for the purposes of this session today, we're going to focus in on the areas in blue. So cohort selection and recruitment or patient identification. Once the trial is actually being executed, the data collection of data on those patients, and then subsequently the analysis of that data. Across all of that, there are challenges and opportunities leveraging digital tools for site activation efficiencies, helping to support compliance, things like Form 1572 that we're hearing about in each one of these sessions, other regulatory and trial operations considerations. And then finally, we wanted to focus on one of the key areas that many of us have been leaning into, certainly in this pandemic and as part of pragmatic trials in general, is a decentralized nature or hybrid nature of the kinds of trials that we can take advantage of. So that's going to be the focus for this session, and those are going to be the areas of questions that we're going to focus on with the panel that we have. Go ahead and advance the slide. So I'm really excited to be joined by a number of experts to cover these topics. You met Dr. John Halamka, the president of Mayo Clinic Platform. He'll be joining us for this session. We have Sally Oken, who is the executive director of Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, or CITI. We have Marco Schito. Marco is the executive director of the Critical Path Institute's Cure Drug Repository Collaboratory. And we have Pamela Tenarts, who's the chief scientific officer of Medable. All right, so we've got a lot to cover. You can go ahead and take down the slides. Let's go ahead and dive right in. I'd like to encourage our audience that as we go through these questions, if you have anything that you'd like us to try to answer live in this panel, please don't hesitate to put your questions in the Q&A section. I'll try to monitor that and make sure that we address any questions that come up as we go through the panel. All right, so with that, I'm going to ask my panelists to come online and we can go ahead and dive into it. So let's start with Dr. Halamka. One of the things that have been certainly looked at by many companies in digital health and in the innovative space and in digital tools is identifying the kinds of patients that might benefit most from participating in a particular kind of trial. We have all sorts of data elements from a patient's medical record. What sort of tools or technologies, approaches have you seen that can be applied in this space to help identify and enroll clinical trial patients?
Well, what a wonderful question. So if you look at the kinds of data we collect as part of clinical care delivery, we have structured data. Of course, it's problems in meds and allergies in labs, demographics, and that kind of thing. We have unstructured data, notes and reports. And here's the challenge. Certainly in Mayo Clinic's experience and working with 10 million patients in our cohort, some of the richest data is in the unstructured text. And the problem is turning unstructured text into knowledge and doing patient selection. So if we have enrollment criteria that describe signs and symptoms, reactions, side effects, the problem is it's not going to be codified. And so here's our interesting challenge and why ACT-POC is so exciting. If you go to a typical community hospital, if you go into a setting that's a non-academic, are they going to have the tools and technologies to do knowledge discovery and unstructured data? They probably will not. Is the EHR going to be fit for purpose? Probably not. And so this is going to be our interesting puzzle. To the outline that you presented at the beginning of cohort selection and data collection and analytics, how can this coalition create a series of open source tools, or if not create open source tools through partnership, joint venture, and collaboration, have a library of tools so that those who may not have huge IT resources can participate in cohort selection in a potentially low cost, low friction way, and maybe even a federated fashion where a whole number of data collectors can be part of a powerful trial without necessarily having to centralize all of the raw clinical data, which can have high cost, but also high political cost or risk.
That's great. That's so true. And I like to turn to Sally. So Sally, I know that over at CITI, you and the coalition that you've built have been doing an enormous amount of work in establishing a vision and a mission towards taking these kinds of tools and building them into the kinds of innovative trial and approaches that we see as part of our future for 2030. You've actually published a document along those lines. What sort of approaches or techniques do you think about when you think about the kinds of tools for cohort selection or data collection once the trial's already begun that can create the kinds of efficiencies, greater inclusivity, and outreach to the kinds of patients that we want included in the trials in 2030?
Well, thank you so much, Brian, for asking an important question, and also for Duke Margolis for inviting me to participate. As you know, CITI is very invested in thinking about ways where we can transform the trial experience to be part of the evidence generation system. And that's really anchored around 5 very important pillars that really drive what we're doing in terms of the ways that CITI is approaching its recommendations and tools and resources that we've been developing over the last number of years. I want to say, though, I'm going to focus a little bit on your diagram that you had at the bottom area where it says, the feedback and learning. One of the things I think we have an incredible opportunity for is to start thinking about creating an evidence base for making trial processes more efficient. The evidence base on this is pretty darn thin at the moment generally, and even that much more thin when we're talking about novel tools like the digital kinds of things that we're speaking about today. So I would really encourage us in terms of the work being done at ACT POC to think about ways of actually almost studying the study elements that we're integrating into the design and the conduct of these trials so that we can begin to learn more rapidly what works and what doesn't, and bring that back into a continuously learning system that we really apply at the research level, but also importantly at the care level. Right. So that's where I think we can really begin to have a true impact. So for me, it's the elements of the opportunities that exist in terms of using these novel digital tools, and some of them are not so novel anymore. We've been using them for a while, but we haven't really created a widely adopted set of standards to help us best understand what's going to be the right tool for this particular work that we need to accomplish, and how do we begin to start generating that kind of data. So that would be my challenge to us and to the active POC group. We have plenty of recommendations, tools, and resources that have been generated from City alone. And then there's plenty of other related efforts that are working in similar areas, and DIME and others that are working very specifically in the digital space. So finding a way of being able to bring that those tools and resources to bear, but also to test them on a regular basis to determine how well they are working or not, and use that as an opportunity for true improvement, continuous learning, and a mechanism for feedback so that we don't replicate the work that's being done in other areas and be redundant in that experience of trying to learn. So I'll stop there, because I think at the bottom line, it's for City, we are not operationalizing trials. We are providing the kinds of guidance and recommendations and tools based on the work that we've brought together with our many member organizations, as well as experts across the field, to provide the kinds of guidance that people might need to get started. But getting started, actually doing it, adopting it, and implementing it is really a huge challenge. So finding a way of being able to learn every time that's done is actually going to serve us so much better at the end of the day. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. I'd actually like to look to Marco, and I'm going to pull John back in to respond to this. So Marco, you help lead a collaboratory with the FDA in this space. I'm curious, how do you incorporate the kinds of feedback from your coalition into a more iterative learning environment across the stakeholders?
Right. So we do engage a number of stakeholders. Obviously, with the FDA, CDRC, or the Secure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory, is a public-private partnership that's funded by FDA. But we do engage with a number of other stakeholders, including patients. And it's one thing I haven't heard too much in this conversation, is ensuring that we have the patients having a voice in the discussions of clinical trials as well. Obviously, they have an interest, and we need to engage with clinicians. And I'm completely aligned with ensuring that we have ways in which we can engage clinicians in the community setting to be able to do that. The way that CDRC is working with FDA is through the advancement and promotion of an app that they've developed in collaboration with NCATS called CureID, that actually allows a systematic collection and sharing of real-world data. And when I talk about real-world data and the collection and sharing of data, this is for a public ability, so it's completely de-identified. And it's really very limited. It's limited in the fact that we just really want to know what the disease is. What are the drugs that are being used? Why are they being used in a new way? And then really the outcomes. And the outcomes are very simple of, does the clinician think that the patient's gotten better, worse, or about the same? So I think what a lot of people had already said here is that we don't necessarily need a lot of information, but we just need to know the right information, and how to capture that may be available in EHRs, but in many cases, it's not available in the EHRs. Or if they are, they're in, as John had mentioned, this unstructured data, which is quite challenging to crack, because that really then increases the level of comfort that we have with regarding the reliability of extracting that data from those records. But I'll stop there and see if John has anything to add to that.
Yeah, I'm curious, John. So I've had the pleasure of working alongside you on a number of coalitions in the digital tooling and technology space. Lessons learned on how you engage and build a vibrant community that has that kind of feedback that Sally was describing there.
Well, really important, if you can, to reduce the friction to entry and participation. So as Brian knows, we had a number of interesting questions to ask during COVID that required real-world evidence and real-world data. But again, asking a smaller organization that even wants to do good and participate in a community to now go do all the extraction of the data and contribution to a large group, it's just tough. So what do? We contacted the EHR manufacturers and worked collaboratively so that the EHR manufacturers created a script which they delivered for free to all of their customers, and it enabled a local CIO or CMO to push a button, run the script, and then get a de-identified extract using a very well-specified set of Boolean logic. And I mean, exactly to the point, Marco, you're making, we had to do things like define what's a ventilator day, right? And if you asked every organization to define a ventilator day, you get 2,000 different answers, right? And so what came out of this was a completely standard ontology that therefore was comparable across sites. And then these organizations did a secure file transfer of the extract that then was analyzed by data scientists that were centrally located, because many of the contributory sites did not have data science. It was done under a single IRB. It was done under a single human subjects, all not housed at the local contributors' sites. So this was truly enabling, in effect, free, frictionless infrastructure, common IRB, common human subjects, common data science, and we got something like 2,000 organizations to participate and a result in 2 weeks.
I think we got some answers on hydroxychloroquine too. So Pamela, I want to turn to you now. So John is alluding to this concept of decentralized trials or across a distributed network of health systems, with reducing the burden that any one of those sites may have in standing up the tools and technologies or aggregating the kinds of data needed to do the analysis. I know that you at Medical have been doing a lot of work in this space. I'm curious if you have thoughts on things like consent. It's a major challenge oftentimes for many researchers to consent the patient at the appropriate time in the appropriate place with the appropriate form. What are your thoughts, or what sort of work are you doing at Medical in terms of e-consent in a more decentralized fashion?
Yes, so thank you for that question. And I also want to thank Margolis for inviting me and sort of thinking through with this panel. It's fabulous to be here on what sort of the steps are that we can take with digital tools in this space. And so with Medical, we do have, one of the ways we think about delivering trials at the point of care is bringing trials closer to where the people are. And the people, I'd say people on purpose, because it's not just participants, but it's the providers are that can help with collecting data. And the bigger systems are then maybe in sort of the big cities where maybe not everybody lives, as we know. And one of the ways that e-consent helps, obviously, is that you can do that from anywhere. You could be able to do with an e-consent system, you can send the consent in advance. And long time ago, I used to run a clinical trial site in Florida, and we mailed the consents if we could, if it wasn't an acute studies. But so you can send the consent ahead of time, and then the consent can be done electronically. And what you could do is either the patient does still come to the site, and you just look at it both on a computer, and there's other options that electronic consent can offer, in that you can embed videos, you can do graphics, you can do little knowledge checks that are really more about, are we sure that the participant can make an informed decision down the road. It's not about, did you hear every single thing every single thing, but are you informed enough to make a good decision, which is really the goal of informed consent, is giving information so that somebody can make an informed decision. But you can also do that remotely, so that then the participant could maybe be participating from home, like via televisit, and the provider, the local community provider, could be a CVS investigator, could walk through the consent with that participant and sort of given an experience that is sort of not just paper to glass. This is a new expression I learned when I came to Medable. Like, it's not just putting the whole consent form literally on a computer, but adding elements in so that people can learn in ways that are helpful to them. Some people learn visually, some people learn in different ways, and have that be an experience that really helps better inform. The benefit of that is that the participant does not have to necessarily come to the site, wherever that site may be. And sort of decentralized trials are really a way to bring research closer to where the people are. And, you know, it's not just e-consent, it's televisits as you needed. If something happens and the participant has a question, they could, you know, request a televisit, and that could be arranged outside of the normal schedule of events so that that could be done more ad hoc. You could collect data locally at where the participant lives in their houses via, you know, via their phones on, you do, you know, ePro collection and things like that. So it's really about point of care is really where people are. And that is how we need to think about it. And it's sort of this combination of PIs and sites, and then extending the clinical trial more to that's convenient to people. I think somebody mentioned in an earlier panel that, you know, visit 6 could be done at Intermountain, for example, versus or at the patient's home versus coming to Intermountain, and sort of thinking about ways where we can bring everything closer to people. But the one thing to keep in mind is, and I want to echo what Sally said, and probably, you know, trace my city background as well, that evidence is really good. And we really need to sort of show that these new tools actually do what we say they do, and that we can bring that back to the community, and that we sort of do this shared learning about what these tools can do. And this is why forums such as this are so important, that we can share what works and what doesn't work, so that we can then improve the system going forward.
That's great. Thanks, Pamela. I want to ask a question of this group. So anyone is, you know, feel free to chime in on this one. One of the things that we've all collectively, I'm sure probably all of the attendees on this panel have thought about, is the role of real world evidence, augmenting or replacing traditional data collection. And I want to pay special attention to what Dr. Brown said about when we move into a new space and we use novel digital tooling, we want to be sensitive to not take on the kinds of risky or challenging areas where you might want to replace the ways data are traditionally collected. But putting that consideration aside for a moment, what are some of the areas where we think the tooling, the approaches to collect real world evidence might replace the way traditional data is collected now, 2 years, 3 years from now?
So Brian, I think go ahead, yep. Sally.
Go ahead, Sally.
I was just going to add that I think one of the areas that's just so critical about real world data, and you know, a lot of my past 12 to 15 years has been spent in the patient generated data space, where we've really tried to understand how do we do that, and how do we do it well, and how do we find ways of being able to take that messiness that happens to come with the narrative kind of experience of people. So I think there's a way of being able to acknowledge that that data is just critically important, and we have to find a way of being able to make it more useful and have a more streamlined way, as John has already described, of writing queries that help us better understand what is in it. But I also think that we also need to then think about ways of being able to understand what's the difference between a traditional approach of collecting that data, an embedded approach of doing it in a more digitized or technologically driven way, and what are we trying to change with that new element that actually we can't accomplish in the traditional way, and really begin thinking about that from the trial design perspective. I think it helps us resolve uncertainties about trial processes in the way that we actually do collect data. But it also pushes us to think about embedding some of these questions right into the trial design, so that we are actually testing our assumptions about whether or not this is actually going to improve the opportunity to get additional data in a more efficient way, or does it in fact pose unintended consequences that we hadn't anticipated? And that's why I think it's so critical for us to be monitoring and evaluating the use of these over the course of the trial design as well as the trial conduct, so we can have almost in a way an A/B way of looking at things, what worked and what didn't, and then move on with those things that did work in an adaptive way that we see in adaptive trials, for example. But as far as the processes are concerned and the operations are concerned.
Well put, Sally. Marco.
Yeah, so we're working closely with Johns Hopkins, who are developing these types of scripts to be able to embed them within a healthcare system. And as John had rightly pointed out, there are some challenges on ontologies and definitions and standards, not only by those definitions, but even just some of the ways in which data is being generated. And we need to know some quality metrics behind those. And some of those may not necessarily be available in the electronic health record, or are going to be buried in sort of this non-structured format. I think what we're wanting to explore is that if we can capture the use of repurposed drugs, how drugs are being used that are fairly safe, that may be generic, that are being used in different ways, at least we don't have the safety issue to be able to contend with and to be able to address and those types of issues from a regulatory perspective. Still, it's going to be an important aspect to capture for sure, but it's not a brand new drug that's a first in human kind of thing. So I think it reduces the level of burden. It reduces the anxiety for both the patients, the clinicians, and the regulators. And that may be sort of the thing that individuals were saying on the call previously in previous sessions. We've got to be able to walk before we can run. And so this may be a low-hanging fruit where utilizing a drug in a new way could be able to do that. We're capturing that to be able to generate hypotheses and information to be able to determine whether that is, but we can turn that on its head, right? And just as Sally had said, why can't we now embed clinical protocols in clinical practice, and then utilizing these tools to be able to extract the data elements that we need out of the electronic medical records, thus reducing the burden on clinicians better at the front line. And that's going to be the sort of what my hope is from the ACT at POC and the large collaborations that are occurring here and the number of individuals that are participating, is to be able to engage in a more productive way to be able to identify ways in which we could all move forward.
That's great. Thanks.
And
oh, go ahead, John. Yeah.
Brian, just one other comment, because that was very well said. In an era where the interoperability rule and the information blocking rule now give us a regulatory requirement to support APIs that transfer data from provider organizations to patients, might we also see some rather novel contributions to clinical trials that would be patient-sourced or patient-stewarded data that is now technologically much more feasible and scalable than ever before?
Yeah, and I think the one thing I would add is some of these techniques are being used already. It is just really hard to find what has worked or what has led to approvals and what has not. Just even simple things like BYOD devices for collecting ePros or patient-generated data, and sort of another plea to sort of create more public accessible databases where that can be found, so people can learn from other people having done it and sort of build upon that in a gradual way.
That's great. Thanks, Pamela, and thanks, John. I want to get to some of the questions from our audience participants here, and so I'm going to go from the top down here. John, maybe I'll turn to you for the first one, because I know that you've been doing a lot of thinking about bias in digital health tooling. The first question here, any suggestions on how to remove bias in pragmatic clinical trials?
So here's an interesting issue. As we looked at our experience during COVID, what we found is cohorts were often rather small, and sites were typically academic healthcare centers. So the population itself was not representative of the diversity of this country. And so one hopes that more data from more sites is going to help us with some of the issues of bias in our selection. And that's only going to happen, as all others have said, is if we make it frictionless and low cost and are providing some of those tools to those organizations that can't provide them on their own.
Indeed. Thanks, John. Sally, I might turn to you next for this next question coming in about the European Union. The European Union is developing regulation to set up a European health data space to help in clinical trials. How likely would the US have a similar repository of health data?
Well, I think it's a bit off in terms of timing, but I do think that there's definite interest in pursuing that kind of opportunity, not only from the perspective of clinical trial data, but also just health data in general. I think we have still a lot of work to do to help establish what the trust is going to need to be amongst the patients and publics around how we're actually using their data and bringing it into a central repository. But I think those are barriers that can be overcome, but the technological capabilities are actually already there. We just haven't really moved on them. I think John raises a great point when, you know, the information blocking and the interoperability rules are already in place. We have to find ways to make the cultural and the sort of the clinical and the operational and policy will come together, where this will actually be something that not only do we want to have as a system-wide approach, but also that from a societal perspective, people expect. You know, I did a lot of work over the years with patients directly when I was with patients like me. And one of the things we heard repeatedly was that people are very interested and willing to have their data shared so long as they can trust that it will be protected. They recognize the value of that experience of having their data be part of the overall experience of other people who have taken this path before them and those who will come behind them. And we just have not done a very good job at establishing trustworthiness that we need to have in order to ensure that the public would want us to pursue this. Now, from a policy perspective and from a legislative perspective, there's certainly barriers there that would have to be put in place. But I think we're increasingly seeing in even the Cures 2.0, as well as in the other work that's being done to modernize clinical trials at the FDA, that having mechanisms where we can maximally take advantage of all the data that we have available to us really will answer some of the questions that we are vexed with today to not answer because we haven't found a way of integrating that data effectively.
Indeed. Thanks, Sally. We're getting quite a few questions. I'm going to apologize in advance. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, maybe one or two more here. John, really quickly, the COVID studies that you mentioned using the scripts to parse EHRs, what was the lever for getting all of those hospitals and care sites to work together to share the extracted data?
So an amazing thing happened during COVID, and that is there was a sense of urgency and competitive angst disappeared, right? So all of us in academic healthcare have different currency, right? Some people want reputation or academic promotion. You know, some people want publication. Well, in a time of COVID, it all came together that everyone felt we would have greater societal benefit if we just put aside our differences and work together for the common good. Really, though the pandemic was a tragedy, I think that is one of the most amazing things that came out of that era.
Wonderful. Thanks, John. And so our last question before we get to closing remarks here, Pamela, e-consent sounds like it has the potential to inform participants better when making an informed consent decision, but does it not also bring a lot of challenges in making sure the patients themselves are consenting versus using a proxy, especially in the remote case? Also, does it introduce challenges in ensuring security of the data being collected? Can you comment some of your thoughts and reflections on that?
Yes, and those are, that's a really good question. And those are indeed the things we worry about, right? Like when we started working on remote, we called them mobile clinical trials in 2015, we had this, it was not about e-consent, but sort of a similar scenario, like how do we know that the wearable the use for the trial wasn't put on the dog and the dog was running around and we were counting their steps instead of the participants. So those questions have been around, and it really is about good identifications and having systems in place where people are identified. And by the way, that goes for the clinician on the other side too, because as we're starting to do clinical trials that maybe are not in your doctor's office where you've been going for 20 years and they know who you are and you know who the doctor is, it kind of goes the same way, right? We want to make sure that both people are identified appropriately, and systems should take that into consideration. And then the collection of the information, security systems are security and privacy I don't know if it's come up today yet, but normally when you talk about digital tools, that is a huge topic of discussion, and it sort of surrounds and envelops all the things we're talking about today. Like if you're going to mine data, if you're using digital tools, all those things. And I think we just have to be like have all the systems in place and be really good stewards when people trust us with their data and do the best we can and sort of, it's the same for electronic health records and things like that. So those are indeed the questions we need to think about and make sure that we have the best answers to.
That's great, Pamela. So we have time for a lightning round of closing comments. I'm going to prompt you guys with something I wrote down here, which Dr. Woodcock said as she was wrapping up her comments. She was reflecting on how research has been done to date and looking back 5 years from the future. She said, how could we have constrained research to such a narrow group, meaning the promise of something like a pragmatic trial, using the kinds of tools that create the kinds of efficiencies and greater inclusivity that digital tools promise. How could we have dreamt of doing research any other way other than in that more inclusive way? John, as your perch at Mayo Clinic platforms and more broadly, just as a leader in the digital health space, and then Pamela and Sally and then Marco, I want you to also chime in from your perspectives and leadership roles in the space. Where do you see us 5 years from now and the way that we conduct research? Are we closer to Dr. Woodcock's vision of a more inclusive, diverse execution for clinical trials?
So Brian, I'm a boundless optimist. And ask the question. I happen to be at Fenway Park right now. Driving the Mass Pike is challenging. I use Waze because it tells me based on thousands of others' experience how I should travel. And shouldn't we expect real-world evidence, real-world data, guides new drug discovery and guides new care pathing treatments, using the data of the past to treat the patients of the future in the most optimal way? So I hope we're there in 5 years.
Pamela?
Yeah, so thanks. I think I'm next. I would hope that the one place where we will have made a tremendous leap forward now is in the representation of people participating in trials representing the diseases that they live with. I think there's a lot of effort in that direction. The minority recruitment plans that are being discussed, the attention to from even medical publishers about making sure that there's transparency about recruitment in clinical trials. I think the efforts that are being put there, I hope we bring those to bear and that we start reflecting in our trials the people that live with the diseases. That's where I hope we will, we really can be. I mean, we're just it's just a matter of doing it. I think, yeah.
Indeed. Thanks, Pamela. Sally?
So I think, again, capitalizing on John's use of the word urgency, for me, it's aligning the urgency of patients to seek solutions to the unmet needs that they have, and taking that and harnessing that so that we begin to energize what works right. And I think that was Samuel who said something like that earlier in his comments. And then operationally, understanding what can we do today, which I think Carrie mentioned earlier, but the next step should be when we do something today, how do we know that it worked? And really being able to move that kind of energy forward so that we're constantly learning and constantly sharing. And I think the ultimate goal here is if in 5 years, we have aligned ourselves against the incentives that really drive people to want to see their unmet needs met, with the urgency that we have in terms of being able to ensure that these processes that we're developing get implemented well, we have to learn and share and be transparent about that and find ways of being able to standardize some of that learning so that we can translate that across the clinical trials enterprise, most importantly to the public.
Thanks, Sally. Marco?
Sorry, I couldn't find my mute button. Thanks. I guess just having this discussion, look at the number of people and number of participants that are on here. I'm really finding it quite amazing that 5 years ago, I think Janet Woodcock, Rob Caleb, We're writing manuscripts about the potential for pragmatic trials and decentralized trials, and really, making that point of engaging a broader community in patients in community settings. And that's not only deals with issues around patients with cancer that we've been talking about, with cardiology, cardiac diseases, but another aspect of this is rare diseases, where the number of patients in a particular setting, even if they are, there are 20 sites within a country, is still going to be quite few. It's just dispersed around the entire country. So that's where community settings really do come in handy. And I've talked to so many patients and patients' moms who have had to deal with this, to travel to get their sons or daughters into those types of care facilities. Can we do it? Yeah, we can. We've done it with recovery. We've done it with solidarity, with Together. I think what we need to do is just do it better, easier, to allow the clinicians that are at the front line, who are very busy, who have a ton of other responsibilities, to be able to contribute to the knowledge, because then we've got to talk about the regulatory aspect, which is, I think, the very next session. And hopefully I'll set that up here, because this is really where the rubber can eventually hit the road. At least if we look at it from the type of trials that we would need to do, if we do that for repurposing drugs that are already approved, but for a different indication, then we've got to be able to officially engage regulators. And if there's no sponsor, if the RLD holder doesn't really want to do this, or the drug sponsor doesn't really want to do this, then there's really a lack of ways to move forward. So, but what are the end goals? And the end goals, I think, as Janet had mentioned, is really to generate sufficient data of high quality that could be sufficient for informing clinical practice. And then that's the next biggest sort of issue. How do we disseminate that information most effectively, so that clinicians really know, oh, this is what I should be using?
Appreciate that, Marco. And I know that we're over, so I'm going to go ahead and quickly ask that we wrap things up, and we're going to pass it over to Rachel from Duke to lead us in our next and final session. I think, Rachel, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be leading our final session for today. We've learned so much throughout this event. There's obviously lots of interest in advancing point of care trials or engaging in their implementation across a range of settings. There's been a lot of efforts to broaden participation in these trials. We've outlined that quite a bit in our own recent released white paper. And really the goal, as the prior panelists mentioned, is really to improve our ability to generate high quality and relevant evidence. So as many who have spoken already have noted, there are lots of policy considerations toward achieving this goal. This includes potential regulatory reforms, as we heard today from Janet. Also payment and reimbursement considerations, incentivizing participation, health system level, and also patient level considerations that may or may not hinder efforts to implement point of care trials. And so, all of that being said, there's a lot more ways in which we can put a finer lens on this to understand ways in which we can overcome these barriers and make progress. And also at the same time, recognize progress that's already been made at the data infrastructure level. So thinking about electronic data systems and other data infrastructures that have made this possible. So speaking more about data infrastructure, it's important that policies governing these infrastructures support their use to efficiently collect reliable data, and that is without compromising important protections and standards, and importantly, without overburdening frontline providers. So for payers and health systems, they, as we learned, and as most of us here know, they often have to make decisions about new treatments with the limitations of evidence at approval in mind. And this evidence rarely includes long-term data, longitudinal data, rarely includes real-world outcomes, or enough information to detect potential differences across a range of subgroups or subpopulations. And this really, in fact, provides opportunity. So this is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, and it gives us motivation, and it gives healthcare providers and health plans motivation as well to figure out how to work together to fill these gaps and overcome these perceived barriers, and also develop policy that would encourage these types of partnerships to address these barriers and other gaps. So it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists for this final session, which will touch on just some of those considerations that I just discussed a moment ago, with help from everyone here today. So I'm joined this afternoon by Bota, who's the Vice Dean for Clinical Research at the University of California, Irvine School of Medicine, and who's also the Medical Director for the University of California, Irvine's Center for Clinical Research. I'm joined by Frederick Masudi, Chief Scientific Officer and the Vice President for Clinical Research and Analytics at Ascension Health. John Concato, who's the Associate Director for Real World Evidence Analytics in the Office of Medical Policy at the US FDA in the Center for Drug Evaluation. And lastly, Lee Fleischer, who's the Chief Medical Officer and Director of the Center for Clinical Standards and Quality at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So each of our panelists will provide brief introductory remarks before we jump into our final discussion for today. We'll go ahead and start with Daniela. Daniela, take it away.
Hello, everybody. It is my pleasure to be here. I'm considering what are going to be the remarks, because a lot of the things that I was thinking about sharing with you today were definitely covered by multiple panelists, but we do have the honor of being the ones where things come together. So I'm talking from my experience as a university clinical research administrator. That's a little bit different than my day-to-day life as a clinical trialist. So I can see both sides of academia, what is at the level of the institution and what's at the level of the individual investigator. I also can see the difficulties that many of our colleagues have when we talk about being involved in clinical trials. The reason for which I started with this is because when we think about barriers, and especially policy barriers, I think that we have to be very systematic. And we have talked together and we have thought a lot about what are the barriers from the point of view of regulatory and federal regulations. But also, I think that we have to start thinking at a little bit more granular level. And I'm including the rules and regulations at the state levels and the Department of Health levels. I haven't heard a lot about that. But then we have to go to the level of our institutions. And we have to think that when we want to consider doing the kind of studies that we are talking about, being at the point of access, at the point of care, then we will need to be able to involve our colleagues in primary care, in internal medicine, in psychiatry. And this is going to be a little bit different than when we do the very complex clinical trials that we do in cancer. And I know that we talked about cancer as well. Doing studies in COVID was a little bit different because all of us knew that we have one common burning problem. And it was a little bit less important how many patients we see during that time, as long as we address the needs, and how many papers we publish during that time. But now when you go back to academic medicine, the coin of the realm goes back to the RVUs and to the ways on which you develop your academic career. So my question that I'm still pondering now, and I hope I'm going to hear from more people, are related to how do we make sure that we have a trained clinical research workforce on our primary care offices, physician and physician extenders. Many of those offices now, many of our community offices do have nurse practitioners and physician assistants and nurse navigators. And for some of those studies, the PIs are not going to be only physicians. They have to include the whole care team. So that's the question that I want us to think about. How do we train and how do we incentivize? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots of good thoughts there. Frederick, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Really happy to be participating in this incredibly interesting discussion today. And thanks to Margolis and the organizers for inviting me to participate. I bring to the perspective of a chief science officer at a large health system developing a national research program. And certainly the challenge we have in engaging point of care clinicians is, we're subject to whoever's willing and able to participate in research. And of course, willingness is related to both incentives and disincentives. And ability relates to the enabling structures that are in place to perform research. And certainly in the current healthcare system, because of a variety of reasons, the cohort of willing and able is oftentimes small. There's some exceptions to that. So service lines where, like in cardiology and oncology, where research is part of the culture of practice or required for the business of practice, or in areas where research is mandatory, so certified stroke centers or level 1 trauma centers, for instance, where research is mandatory, that can enhance the willingness and ability to participate in research. But certainly the things we want to focus on are the administrative burden, and this is something that's come up many times in the discussion already. This issue of training and regulatory requirements. Trying to streamline those. I like the idea of modularizing those, as Dr. Brown spoke about, not in a manner, of course, that would erode the purpose of those regulations, but certainly to simplify those things. And I think there is an opportunity also for clarity around certain issues. So the good example being cold calling, where I think there's the lack of clarity results in a more conservative interpretation of the issue, and therefore it's something that's not permitted. And so I think clarity around regulations is also something that would be highly beneficial to health systems. There's also this issue of decreasing the burden of time for the PI and the local team. And when it comes to potential policy issues, some of it has to do with the acceptability of this naturalistic and real world data in the process of conducting clinical trials. I think we need to think about what's the minimum viable product for a trial that's going to pass muster for whatever purpose it's designed, rather than thinking about how are we going to build the next Cadillac. And when we're thinking about the minimum viable product, my hope is that oftentimes that'll include the use of naturalistic data, sometimes registry data if those are available, but even normalized EHR data when those are possible, and considering those as valid sources of data for the purposes of clinical trials. I'm glad to see our colleague from the FDA engaged in this conversation as well. And the final thing is compensation. We struggle with that a lot, and I know it's not ours alone. Compensation models are driven directly by payment models. So if payment is fee for service, then compensation is going to be along the lines of productivity. And payment for value-based purchasing is not necessarily the answer there either, unless the specific questions are those that are aligned with the value that's being reimbursed for. Certainly, contracts can be modified to enable some of this, so there can be carve-outs for administrative time that could be used for research time, but ultimately that time has to be paid for. So we need to figure out how to align the public health benefit that's derived from the trials and translate that into support for research. And the one last comment, I know we're kind of over time, but this issue of alignment of the question with what is going on in terms of clinical and quality objectives is really key. I found that it's much easier to consider engagement around a trial that, say, focuses on diabetic retinopathy screening, when that's one of the quality metrics that we're pursuing, than it is, say, a niche drug where we just have to really depend upon an individual clinician with a passion for something, rather than being able to engage the larger enterprise in the question at hand. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. A lot more to think about and consider. I'm really excited about this panel. John.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Rachel, and meeting organizers. I'm very pleased to be here as well, although I'm sorry that I was unable to join the conference until now. So I'll offer a few high-level comments about the session topic, and hopefully it's aligned with what's been discussed. It sounds like I missed a great meeting, and then comment specifically about some FDA efforts in this space. So again, this is probably redundant, but as we know, the era of digital data is enabling innovations in clinical trial design, such as decentralized trials and point of care trials. And I think we should, it's presumably been said, but as these approaches become more feasible, the inherent nature of these trials will inevitably increase the percentage of and diversify the pool of, right, eligible adult patients who participate in clinical research. So we can't take that for granted, but the rising tide hopefully will lift all boats. So I'm sure there's been much discussed, and we already heard it in this session, focusing on reimbursement, on training, on regulatory reform and other issues. It's necessary and important, but I did catch at the end of the prior session that just something as simple as more experience overall and successful examples of trials that achieve more diversity would be helpful. So FDA is certainly supportive of changes and wants to find ways to support changes in research infrastructure that can support point of care trials. We don't conduct them ourselves, we can support them, but mainly we receive them, as we know. And you know, this conference obviously is all about addressing the related challenges, how point of care trials can be designed to provide reliable and persuasive results. Additional issues, if they've all been solved, that would be great, but how will methods for randomization and product dispensing be implemented at clinical sites? We might, in the panel discussion Q&A, talk about how COVID has and maybe hasn't helped give us some, well, it has given us some experience in that regard. How will blinding be accomplished when needed? What does safety monitoring look like in point of care trials? What endpoints are suitable for you? Should we start with endpoints that are more suitable? So I heard the phrase walk before we run. So as with other scenarios where real world data are included in regulatory submissions, it's important for me to say we will maintain our evidentiary standards, but at the same time, we'll be open-minded about types of data and types of study design. The two are not irreconcilable. And I think that's important to be clear about. Certainly a related topic, and again, sorry I missed the session, is data collection specifically through the use of digital health technologies, digital tools, whatever we call them, sensors, software, computing platforms. I mean, that's really right the apex of truly real world data, if it's on our wrist or the equivalent when we're at home in our normal day-to-day lives. So the opportunities there are self-evident: convenience for patients, ability for continuous monitoring, inherent improvements in trial efficiency. And again, the point of this session is increase in more diverse participation in clinical research can be the result, but that's the foundation that we have to build on. And here I would just say, to foreshadow what presumably we'll be discussing, is I think we need an ongoing dialogue between technology developers, sponsors, clinicians, regulators, payers, and patients to advance these approaches rigorously, of course, but responsibly and realistically. So just a couple of thoughts. While these shifts have been occurring and hopefully fueled by meetings such as today's, FDA has been working on several fronts in our own backyard to enhance or at least provide transparency on diversity in clinical research. In terms of knowing what's happening, our drug trial snapshots, hopefully everyone is aware, they make demographic data available and transparent for clinical trials that supported FDA approval of new drugs. So it's having such data is sort of an obvious basic requirement for understanding and then addressing problems with diversity. Shifting more to the policy focus that can improve practice. I'll just mention a 2020 FDA guidance on enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations. It's only a guidance, but it really encourages sponsors to have representative age, sex, race, ethnic, and other diverse enrollment. And it offers specific recommendations to reduce the burden for participation and for enhanced community engagement. More recently, a guidance from April of this year provides recommendations and asks sponsors to develop a race and ethnicity diversity plan to enroll representative numbers of participants from underrepresented US populations. And of course, to do that, point of care trials and the like can be a big help. I know real world data were mentioned. I do quote unquote real world data, real world evidence. I'll call them non-interventional studies at the moment, but certainly non-interventional studies that incorporate real world data also have a role to play and might have a step up. We talk about enhanced generalizability.
no two databases are identical, but clearly the problem of tertiary medical centers having been the site of many traditional randomized trials is removed if you have a database, say, of electronic health record or claims data that is more diverse inherently. So with those overarching comments, I'll stop here and say thank you again, and I look forward to the upcoming discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Lastly, I'll turn it over to Lee.
Yeah, thank you so much. And when Mark invited me, I didn't know he invited me in the role of a CMS regulator, but 2 years ago, at the beginning of COVID, I was a chair of an academic department overseeing clinical trials in which we stood up, one of my faculty stood up an international database to look at what happened. I'm an anesthesiologist with intubations around the time of COVID. So got to really see how, as the previous panel talked about, sort of COVID galvanized the desire to get information faster, to do a lot of point of care trials, to do very simple data collection instruments to get the answer fast. So I think, getting back to those incentives, I think that's really important. And fast forward, and I still am a health services researcher, thinking about the power of CMS and our data systems to sort of supplement a lot of the work and working with the FDA as we think through coverage with evidence development. And really, as we've reinvigorated that at the end of the previous administration and with some of our recent decisions, we really have focused on that idea that we need not only continue data collection, but as you heard and John talked about sort of his guidances, and you heard in our final decision regarding the monoclonal antibodies for Alzheimer's treatment, the need to collect data and ensuring equity and ensuring diversity of that data to look at how diverse populations actually respond to some of the treatments. So I really see that as we go forward for some of the work with the FDA, there'll be more and more interest in how you marry up either the clinical trials or the post-trial surveillance. And rather than doing what we've traditionally done, which is focus on registries, how do we do something simple that's supplemented with the really robust data that we own in our claims data? And I think that's going to be really important. One of the things that we've been thinking about in releasing our recent quality strategy and thinking through in my center, the Center for Clinical Standard and Quality, is how do we actually think about that as we look at coverage decisions and we look at care decisions, that we actually have the quality metrics and therefore the data with respect to the outcomes. So that in fact, we could get some of those outcomes in a much more diverse population and have health services researchers use that data to ask really important questions. The other thing that, so getting to sort of a supplemental data is some of the things working with NIH as well as FDA that we're thinking quite a bit about. The other thing is that we're thinking a lot about FHIR and FHIR apps as the future of quality measurement. And if you think about that ability or that thought process through the work of the ONC and interoperability should allow those clinical trials to be much more diverse because we can pull the data. Now that's 5 to 10 years in the future, but that means we have to start planning really now. I would be remiss in actually saying that during the pandemic, we created an improvement metric, which was participation in COVID clinical trials. So that our team at CMS really thought it was important, the administrator endorsed this, of adding in. So those are the perspectives that we're looking at. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you so much. Wonderful hearing from each of you. Thanks again for providing, to each of you for providing your perspectives. We are going to go ahead and start our discussion. So we do have a question from an audience member that is probably directed to you, John. Can a point of care trial be used for label updates, and what are the key considerations for such a use of a point of care trial?
As I said earlier, we are open to different types of study design and data. So I would say the general answer is yes, but on the other hand, it's not a checklist or a reference document we could pull out and say, just look at this list and you're all set. I think it obviously depends on the Drug Outcome Association of Interest. And as has been mentioned, there's sort of two extremes. One is if it's a new molecular entity, where how feasible is going to be to do it. On the other hand, if there's little to no interest among the sponsors, how is it going to come to FDA? So in between that, there's enough room to work with. I will say, and this is not an example of an FDA submission, but I was wondering if the VA diuretic comparison project has come up as an example of a point of care trial during the session that unfortunately, again, I missed. I just think it's a wonderful example. Now, granted, the VHA healthcare system is not the most generalizable population and also not easily replicated, but as a national healthcare system, I think there's a 2016 publication of the study design. So predates 21st century cures, predates a lot of what we're talking about today, but it demonstrates how, in that case, it was hypochlorothiazide and chlorthalidone could be compared in a point of care trial. So that again is not FDA, is probably not going to come to FDA at this point, but I would say that success begets success. So I'll leave it to the field to come up with creative ideas and look for low-hanging fruit and opportunities. And we'll be open-minded about it's basically, are the data fit for use? Does the study design generate adequate evidence? And was the regulatory conduct in keeping with what it needs to be? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, as we heard from Janet earlier, drugs can be approved with a broad label. So it actually will, one of those low-hanging fruit opportunities that you just alluded to might be to generate, or at least identify opportunities to generate evidence through point of care trials with respect to patient segments within the broad population. And so from there, we'll be able to determine, what clinical characteristics might subpopulations present that would warrant them, for inclusion in a point of care trial, even thinking about demographic subgroups, to your point about clinical trial diversity. So yeah, lots of opportunities there, and thank you for your perspective. So we have another question from the audience. Can CMS envision creating similar participation metrics for physician referrals to non-COVID trials?
Yeah, it all depends on the priority of the administration. I think that, during COVID, it was a priority to get information of how to treat better, but certainly it will be on the discussion.
Awesome, thank you. All right. So I'm going to ask just some, generally broad questions. How can we better leverage reimbursement strategies and incentives to get clinicians to actually participate in clinical trials? So thinking of the frontline healthcare system in and of itself, how can point of care trials become a reality through the use of payment and incentives through healthcare at the front line?
You asking everyone?
Open to the group, whoever wants to chime in.
My question is the incentive part, and clearly payment is a question to us, and we created something in MIPS. But I was involved immediately prior to the public health emergency with meetings about embedded research within health systems and the value of that to addressing value-based care. So I think as far as for a health system, so internal to a health system, there are, especially with value-based care, there are incentives from an implementation science perspective of sort of what works in the health system. The ability to collaborate will take more thought, but it's a great question.
I would add that, again, we are talking about the level of the policy level. And I think that recognizing the work that's being done for the participation in clinical trials, it's very important concepts that many of us have tried to implement, and I'm looking forward to hear from other of my colleagues how they have achieved it, are the ideas of the research FTE. Can an institution that it's an academic or a private big system that wants to move the science forward, can that institution reinvent and reinvest some of the funds generated by clinical practice or by research to replace and incentivize participation in clinical trials, physician participation in clinical trials?
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with the point about embeddedness. That's absolutely key. It's much easier to engage in research that's in service of the larger healthcare enterprise, particularly as it's aligned with reimbursement. And yeah, I think with respect to reimbursement, again, there are ways to develop carve-outs for non-clinical activities, and research could be one of them, just like administration can be one of them as well. The real question then becomes, well, how is that paid for? And with sponsored trials, it's easy to kind of think how that gets paid for with less well-funded studies, many of which are the ones that we may be most interested in. It becomes more challenging to think about how you create the reimbursement for those non-clinical activities.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, well, I have more questions. So thinking about some of the barriers and burdens that we talked about today to point of care trial implementation, some of the barriers being legal or even regulatory, how can policy help overcome some of these barriers? So thinking about the need to revise or develop current policies or develop new policies, how can that be leveraged to really create or at least help create research infrastructure that might support point of care trial implementation at a broader range of participating sites? And that's open to the group.
Yeah, again, I would say clarity and streamlining is what it's all about. Making sure that it's, again, a lot of legal departments will take the most conservative interpretation of just about anything. So making sure that that there's clarity around practices that help catalyze and support research is important. Again, streamlining things to the extent possible while not eroding their original intent is really important.
I'm going to go on to the training, and I will say that assuring that the right amount and however the minimum amount of training or whatever it's the optimal amount of training it's offered, the differences between standard trials and POC trials, it's visible. So making sure that we don't overburden, and in the same time we protect patients' rights. So I think we're going to have to give more thought about how we can achieve both of those things at the same time.
To that, I'll make a general observation. Our regulations in general overall were written with clinical trials in mind, as we know, and they've survived the test of time exceedingly well for trials. And even in the real world data, real world evidence space, like last year, FDA approved a drug using observational real world evidence program tacrolimus using 21 CFR 314.126. I apologize, but basically the same evidentiary standard is the point I'm trying to make. But here now we're talking about, again, regulations, say, for that involve investigator oversight, et cetera. They had trials in mind, so our predecessors did a great job. I think we can glean a little bit from the COVID pandemic. Again, we wish it didn't happen, hardly a silver lining, but in our COVID clinical trial conduct guidance, conducting clinical trials during the COVID-19, blah, 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 we actually had a question come in, addressed it. If the patient was traveling actually quite some distance to receive their medical product at a brick and mortar trial site, how could we enable that during the COVID-19 pandemic? So of course, product quality, product accountability were issues, but the local providers, we ended up saying they did not have to be on the Form 1572 as long as the product administration was within their scope of practice. Now, to be fair, the COVID guidance expires when the public health emergency is declared over. So I'm saying that it's in the public domain, but yes, you might say, well, what is FDA going to do when the public health emergency lapses? And that we're working on that. But I think it's a useful example to think about that the regulations are there, but we're not going to subvert them, of course, but it takes a while to change them. So what can we do within the existing regulations that honors those regulations, protects patients, protects scientific rigor, but also doesn't have us be so paralyzed that we don't get anything done and we don't have progress made in the name of public health improvements.
And I think on the CMS side, getting back to that sort of standardized set of outcome measures that could end up being quality measures, so that, and using the US CDI and the transparency would be the greatest thing to be able to aggregate across sites in a standardized method, and certainly getting to FHIR to make it easier, that you don't necessarily have to enter much data, if any data, into your beyond your EHRs would be critical, but that's looking ahead.
Yes, for sure. Thank you all so much for joining us for this terrific discussion. We're going to go ahead and turn it back to Dr. Mark McClellan, who will close us out for today. Thanks again.
Great. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks all the panelists for this last very important session on policy considerations related to advancing frontline point of care trials. We've heard a lot about how to advance those trials today. In our first session with health system leadership, we heard about providers' interest in discovering needed evidence to enable them to improve care for their patients, and some commitments to finding ways to reduce the regulatory burden, to use health system supports and other new technology, supporting technology developments and the like to enable that, enable rejuvenation of participation in trials at a time when healthcare providers need some rejuvenation. Accomplishing these goals for point of care trials is an important part, as you heard, of many growing number of health systems goals of continuous care improvement work. And that's why the Active Point of Care Coalition has been growing, I think has reached a critical mass. We also heard about approaches for operationalizing these kinds of practical trial platforms to address important evidence gaps right now in such areas as cardiovascular disease outcomes and pandemic response. And we heard about a range of tools that are making it possible to get confidence in and streamline fit-for-purpose data collection, as well as to engage patients, assure that patients are protected, and in enabling them to work with their clinicians in feasible approaches at the point of care. We also heard throughout many of our sessions about the importance of trust. And I want to stick on this. Trust is paramount to bringing providers, patients, others that need to come together in bringing clinical research, meaningful clinical research, to a broader range of sites and contexts. We talked about this through many of our sessions today, starting with Dr. Woodcock's opening remarks about the potential for building on the local established clinician-patient relationships to bring more and more diverse patients into meaningful clinical trials and to bring more relevant evidence and up-to-date practice to those patients. The Active Point of Care Coalition aims to build on today's discussions to advance practically relevant evidence generation at the point of care. There are certainly important challenges here around assuring a high level of patient protection and active participation, around data quality and other aspects, key aspects of the quality of clinical trial design, and fitting all of this into busy day-to-day practice. But you also heard today about the growing alignment on the importance of developing better, practically relevant evidence at the point of care to improve outcomes, to avoid unnecessary costs, to fill in the critical gaps between what our healthcare systems and medical technologies could do and the disparities and poor outcomes that we actually see too often in practice. We heard about promising directions for regulatory updates to work with healthcare organizations that can provide important supports for clinical practice and reliable research with strong protections. We heard about promising steps for improving the routine use of electronic data and remote data collection directly from patients at home to reduce trial burden. We heard about promising opportunities for alignment with payment reforms and quality improvement goals related to better outcomes for all segments of diverse populations that have many common chronic diseases. And we heard about some near-term opportunities to fill these gaps. The ACT at Point of Care Coalition is committed to providing a critical mass to make progress on addressing these key evidence gaps, the obstacles to achieving our shared goals of high quality care with better outcomes and progress on health disparities. And I hope you all will stay tuned for more activities and initiatives coming from the ACT at Point of Care Coalition in the coming weeks and months. In the meantime, we encourage all of you who joined us today and are sticking with us now to reach out if you're interested in learning more about ACT at Point of Care and its mission and activities. And I think there may be some further room for working with us or collaborating towards our goals. The slide that we're putting up has some additional contact information on who you can reach out to about this. And while you're looking at that, I do want to end by thanking all of our panelists, all of our moderators for participating today in these lively and timely discussions on such important issues. I also want to thank all of the members of the ACT at Point of Care Coalition and our collaborators for helping to inform today's event, for working with us on these challenges. And I also want to thank the people at Duke Margolis who helped make it possible, along with our collaborators at MITRE, Trevin Locke, Brian Cantor, Kaylee Probst, Marianne Hamilton-Lopez, Luke DeRocher from here at Duke Margolis, Adam Croach, and Nicole Persing from MITRE. And then a last thanks to all of you for attending today and for sticking with us on this very important journey to better evidence. Take care and have a good evening.